Ronald Wilson Reagan will become the 40th President of the United States. He'll be sworn into office in ceremonies on the steps of the Capitol on January 20th, 1981. Ronald Reagan was born in Tampico, Illinois, February 6, 1911. He grew up in several small towns in the rural northern part of the state, but his family eventually settled in the town of Dixon. It was there, while in high school, that Reagan performed for the first time in a school play. After graduating from Eureka College, he began working as a sports announcer for a Des Moines, Iowa radio station. In 1937, while in California covering baseball spring training, an agent from Warner Brothers signed Reagan for his first motion picture. That marked the beginning of a 28-year acting career that included more than 50 films. Reagan's acting career was interrupted by World War II, when he served as an officer in the United States Army Air Force. When he was discharged, he returned to the film industry, but this time his attention was directed to the more political aspects of Hollywood as a New Deal Democrat. In 1947, Reagan was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild. Reagan was divorced from his first wife, actress Jane Wyman, in 1948. The couple had 2 children, a son and a daughter. In 1952, he married Nancy Davis. They later had a son and a daughter. He slowly turned conservative in these years and entered national politics in 1964 as a Republican when he campaigned on television for Barry Goldwater. It was after that appeal that several California businessmen suggested that Reagan run for governor. He easily captured the Republican Party's 1966 nomination and later that year won the governor's chair from the incumbent Edmund Brown. Almost immediately after that California election, Reagan assumed national political stature. In 1968, his name came up often as a possible presidential candidate. But his bid for the nomination proved to be unsuccessful. In 1976, another try for the GOP's top spot. In the '76 campaign, he attracted much support among conservatives. He also won a number of delegates in the West and South, but his backing was not strong enough, and he lost the nomination to Gerald Ford by a slim margin. He tried again last year. Reagan kicked off his successful bid for the nation's highest office November 13, 1979. Under the strategy direction of John Sears, Reagan kept a low profile, appeared infrequently. But Reagan's absence from political hustings became a major issue, and in February, changes were made in the Reagan camp. Sears and his cautious strategy were dumped. Reagan hit the campaign trail with a vengeance, and the candidate began to gain momentum. Soon, Reagan's fellow Republican nominees fell behind, and in July in Detroit at the Republican National Convention, Reagan was chosen to run for president. His choice for a running mate stirred much speculation, and for a while it appeared former President Gerald Ford might be part of a so-called co-presidency. That speculation was quickly dissolved when Reagan announced George Bush, a former rival for the nomination, would be his vice presidential choice. In the late summer and fall of 1980, the run for the presidential office took on a fevered pitch. The candidates, Reagan, the incumbent, Democrat President Carter, and independent John Anderson, traveled widely. President Carter met Reagan in a face-to-face debate in late October in Cleveland. Independent Anderson took part in the discussion, but only in a special arrangement provided by the cable news network. It was the one-on-one debate, some pollsters say, had an effect on the undecided voter, putting them in the Reagan camp.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you'll vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
As the campaign dwindled to a few days, the polls showed the race tightening, and many pollsters claimed the race was too close to call. As the votes were counted, however, the nation's choice was clear. 69-year-old Ronald Reagan would be the next president. Bob Kane, Cable News Network.
Thank you, Bob. Up in New York City, former Congresswoman Bella Abzug is with our correspondent Lou Dobbs.
Bella, we've heard a lot of talk about the economic pocketbook issues in this war and peace. What role do you see women's rights playing in the outcome of this election?
Well, I think it's important to know that more men are voting for Reagan than women are. I have a real problem with the way the press has handled the issues affecting women. Take the question of the debate. After the debate, the press was very impressed with the fact that Reagan didn't fall apart. And he talked vaguely about being for equal rights, but the press never really pointed out that, that he and the Republican Party platform rejected the Equal Rights Amendment, that they are calling for a constitutional amendment to reverse the Supreme Court's decision that the right of abortion is a right of choice. On the question of minimum wage, which, for example, would affect women very deeply because they are at the bottom of the economic ladder and 43 million women are working, they sloughed it off, you see, instead of pointing out what the real issues were in this campaign, so that the public was dealing with the fact that maybe he appeared to be a cooler person than a man that had actually called, for example, for using military intervention in about 10 places in the last period of time.
But Bella, isn't it
and
really...
women are concerned not only with their economic needs, the Equal Rights Amendment and abortion, but the question of war and peace. In fact, all the polls show that women care more about peace than do men. So I think that that it hasn't been fully clarified. But I believe that, for example, in New York, where Elizabeth Holtzman is in a very tight race, running for the United States Senate, that her victory, which may come through, will prove that we still have a strong feeling that we need a woman like her, not only because she's a woman, because she stood for women's rights, economic needs, understands the need to create a peaceful approach to the settlement of international disputes.
Bella, certainly not defending the press and its handling of this election and campaign, but isn't it really up to Ronald Reagan's opponent in this campaign, President Carter, to have sharply defined those women's issues?
I think that's a very good point. I believe that President Carter did talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, but I think he didn't raise the fundamental desires that women have overwhelmingly in this country sufficiently as part and parcel of his campaign, and didn't appeal strongly enough to that constituency. In fact, the truth is that, unfortunately, though he is a strong supporter of the ERA, he didn't help us get a state ratified. He cut the budget affecting economic needs of women, and he has always been opposed to Medicaid funding for abortion. And I think that that hurt.
Bella, thank you very much. With former Congresswoman Bella Abzug, I'm Lou Dobbs in New York. Now back to Mary Alice Williams and Bernard Shaw.
Thank you, Lou. Bella, the vote tallies come in inevitably toward their final conclusion. We will, of course, be following them. Right now, let's go back to the news desk and Kathleen and Bill.
Thank you, Mary Alice. Well, we are going to have a live report this evening from James Alan Miklashevsky, who is in Pueblo, Colorado, with a family of one of the American hostages in Iran. The hostage name is William Gallegos. We have this report from James. He is standing by in Pueblo. James?
We're here outside the home of the Gallegos in Pueblo, Colorado. They have just left but a few minutes ago after watching the early election returns in which it appeared to them at least, and most of America, that Ronald Reagan will be our next president. Now, the news was greeted with some dismay, especially by Mrs. Gallegos. In an earlier interview today, after the two voted, they both indicated that they voted for President Carter, indicating that he had done what he could to free the hostages, and perhaps out of fear for what they thought Ronald Reagan might do. And I say the word fear emphatically. Mrs. Gallegos was in near tears for fear that young Bill would be subject to negotiations between the Iranians and Reagan, until she was reminded that President Carter, even if he should be defeated tonight, would still have several more months in office to resume those negotiations. At that point, Mr. Gallegos told us that he thought if Reagan was to win tonight, that Bill and the rest of the hostages would be released very shortly, because the Iranians, too, are in fear of negotiations with Ronald Reagan. As I said, they both left a few minutes ago. They'll be here later for their reaction. They didn't want to talk on camera until President Carter perhaps should concede later tonight. But they will be with us sometime later tonight to give us their reaction as I explained it to you. So we'll be back with you sometime later tonight with the Gallegos of Pueblo, Colorado.
Thank you, James.
And we'll be looking forward to that. When Prime News 120 continues, the latest on the Middle East, and of course, more election returns. Stay with us.
At 15 minutes after the hour, here are the news headlines to this minute. It appears Ronald Reagan is headed for an overwhelming victory over President Carter. With 13% of the vote counted, Reagan is leading the president 51 to 43%. John Anderson has picked up 5% in the race for the White House. President Carter has reportedly drafted a concession statement. He wanted to deliver it earlier, but White House Press Secretary Jody Powell said wait. Voting turnout is heavy, disproving earlier predictions that only 55% of the electorate would vote. And OPEC's 20th anniversary went uncelebrated today because of the war between Iran and Iraq, 2 OPEC members. Bill?
The 52 American hostages began their second year in captivity today, and Tehran has said the first U.S. reply to Iran's conditions for the hostages' release is not good enough. The U.S. reportedly has said it won't deal with Iran until all the hostages are released. Iran has demanded the U.S. comply with the demands first before a release. Iran now is demanding another reply from Washington, a public statement through the media rather than private diplomatic channels, but the State Department says that won't happen. Meanwhile, thousands of Iranians gathered at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran today. The demonstrators, reportedly from all parts of the country, marked the first anniversary of the takeover of the embassy. The Iranians shouted slogans and carried banners denouncing President Carter and Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. The demonstrators were allowed inside the embassy grounds, but the throng apparently did not see the American hostages.
Iraq is claiming major victories in Iran's oil capital, Awaz, and the site of Iran's major oil refinery, Abadan. Iraq's defense minister said all the roads in the southwest province of Khuzestan have been captured by Iraqi troops. Reportedly, Abadan is so devastated that it will take years to be reconstructed. Iraq's army also claims to have encircled Awaz with no route of escape. Iraqi President Saddam Hussein has offered to pull out his troops tomorrow if Iran accepts Iraqi's territorial claims. No response from Iran yet.
A Los Angeles police officer who was wounded by a sniper 2 months ago now has been charged with selling police secrets to drug dealers. The 13-year veteran Sergeant Eugene Ingram was relieved from duty pending the outcome of the case against him. Ingram also was accused of accepting $1,000 from a known narcotics dealer. He now must decide whether to resign the force or face charges in the internal department investigation. If found guilty, he would be dismissed from the force. The district attorney says he does not plan to file criminal charges against the officer.
3 Florida police officers were wounded in a shootout near Gainesville today. A 26-year-old man barricaded himself in a house and fired shots at his boss, who was called to pacify him. Police tried to talk Clarence Crosskey out of the house, but that didn't work. Authorities finally stormed the house after a 9-hour standoff. 3 officers and the suspect were wounded. 1 officer was shot in the face, and he may lose 1 eye. Police say that they aren't sure why Crosskey took that action.
Coming up on Prime News 120, more election results.
Hi, I'm Ted Turner, and this is Cable News Network. For the first time in history, you can see the news as it happens, 24 hours a day, right here on Cable News Network, the world's only all-news television network.
15% of the ballots are in, and it appears that Ronald Reagan is headed for an overwhelming victory. For more on the election results, here's Mary Alice William and Bernard Shaw.
Nearly 4 years ago, Jimmy Carter walked out from Capitol Hill on Inauguration Day to begin serving his term in office as the Democratic Party standard bearer and President of these United States. And right now, Jimmy Carter is preparing to get into the presidential limousine and ride up to the hotel in Washington, where he will be making his concession speech, conceding Governor Reagan has won this election tonight. Mary Allison, when the president does arrive there, we'll be going there live, of course, to hear him.
He is doing that, Bernie, even before all the polls in this country have closed. And here's why. We have the latest numbers right now, and they indicate that Governor Reagan is leading with nearly 7 million votes, holding at 52%. President Carter at close to 6 million votes, 43%. John Anderson has picked up 1 percentage point. He has 710,000 votes with 5%. The Reagan numbers that you see represent Reagan complete electoral sweeps in Connecticut, Oklahoma, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Alabama, Kansas, Indiana, Ohio, South Dakota, Nebraska, Virginia, Florida, New Hampshire, Texas. A good cross-section of the whole country. In fact, the only two areas that President Carter has taken are Georgia, his own backyard, and the District of Columbia, where he has spent the last 4 years. The states that Reagan won include a cross-section of the country, northeastern industrial states, major Farm Belt states that traditionally would have voted Democratic, but then President Carter enforced a grain embargo that made him most unpopular in the Farm Belt. In some of the industrial areas, particularly the auto industry areas, Detroit, Philadelphia, Chicago. Blue-collar workers, which would ordinarily, traditionally, have voted Democratic, have not. They have voted Republican and given the race to Governor Ronald Reagan.
Alice, perhaps it would be good to tell everyone what's at stake. It's going to be interesting to see whether Governor Reagan's coattails are wide enough to bring in other Republicans elsewhere. We're talking about 13 governorships up tonight, 34 Senate seats, all 435 seats in the House. And in the state houses, 31 of the governors across this country are Democrats, 19 are Republicans. In the Senate, 59 are Democrats, 41 are Republicans. Now let's take a look at this Senate race in Alabama. Mr. Denton, the Republican candidate, the former Navy admiral who came back as a prisoner of war, has jumped out in front of Mr. Folsom with about 51% of the vote as you see it. He's got just under a 10,000 vote lead Denton has. Let's take a look at some of the other races. In Florida, the totals thus far, 273, a little over 273,000 for Gunter, and Hawkins is trailing. He has 266,000, 51 to 49%. This is how it looks in that Senate race in North Carolina. So far, the Democrat Morgan is ahead of East there, 138,000 to 129,000.
The next one we have up is Georgia, the Georgia Senate, where Senator Herman Talmadge has defeated decisively Mac Mattingly, his Republican challenger. Herman Talmadge beat a well-publicized bout with alcoholism and an equally, in fact, more well-publicized investigation by the House of Congress on accusations that he had misused public funds. In Oklahoma, Nichols is beating Coates by a decisive 10% so far.
That's the state senator, the Republican there, Don Nichols, out in Oklahoma. Henry Bellman, who was the incumbent, a Republican, he's retiring this year. Up in Pennsylvania, we were wondering how this race would turn out. Former Pittsburgh Mayor Pete Flaherty, who also served in the administration, apparently is hanging on so far to a very slim lead over Arlen Specter, the Republican challenger. Flaherty with 52% of the vote counted thus far, and both men are extremely popular in Pennsylvania. It'll be interesting to see what happens in that race later on.
Bernie, there are some races, Senate races notably, where there were not surprises. Senators Mathias of Maryland and Dole of Kansas have re-won their nomination. Chris Dodd, the son of Thomas Dodd in Connecticut, has won in Connecticut over former senator from New York, now running in Connecticut, James Buckley. In North Dakota, Representative Mark Andrews, a Republican, has won the Senate seat there, defeating Kent Johansson. Looking at other races, and for one, a major change in the Democratic leadership in the House, third ranking in the hierarchy, Representative John Bradamus of Indiana has been defeated. He was the House Majority Whip. He lost to 27-year-old John Hiller. And as you know, of course, the first senator to be defeated on this election night, Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, head of the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, was also defeated as Ronald Reagan swept the Hoosier state.
Bayh was trying for an unprecedented third term, I believe, and that's never been done before. In fact, when Bayh won in the the Senate, he was described as the boy wonder because he had defeated Homer Capehart, a very famous legislator from the Hoosier State. So history has repeated itself for Birch Bayh in Indiana tonight.
Going into this election, many leaders of the grand old party indicated that there would be a Republican renaissance this year. At least that's what they were hoping. Well, it might not be quite that, but again, going into the election this morning, the Republicans were hoping to gain 4 or 5 Senate seats, 25 House seats, 2 governorships, and the control of up to 15 state legislators in this country. We'll be following those votes.
And we'll be taking the tallies to see just how well the Republicans do as Ronald Reagan makes his blitz for the White House. That's the latest from our CNN Election 80 coverage. At this moment, we're going to rejoin Bill Zimmerman and Kathleen Sullivan.
And when Prime News 120 continues, Dallas Raines will have a weather forecast. Stay with us.
Republican, Democrat, Independent vote, swing state, Southern strategy, Election 80, Carter, Anderson, Reagan analysis, third-party candidate incumbent.
At 29.5 past the hour, here are the headlines to this minute. President Carter, told by his pollster Pat Caddell that it is all over, reportedly is preparing to concede defeat to Ronald Reagan in the 1980 presidential election. We are, in fact, anticipating that Mr. Carter's concession will come within the next few minutes. With 17% of the raw vote counted now, Mr. Reagan leads Carter 51 to 43%. John Anderson trailing a poor third with 5% of the vote. In other headlines, Iran demands a public response from the United States to terms set Sunday for the release of the 52 American hostages. And convicted mass murderer Charles Manson has been denied parole for the 3rd straight time. Now the news continues.
And Bill with us now is our meteorologist, Dallas Raines. And the weather didn't get involved in today's election day very much. Pretty clear, and no thunderstorms or rain to hamper voters.
Well, we had a little rain, Kathleen, on the East Coast from the northeast down along the Atlantic coast. But other than that, it was a pretty nice day. A lot of sunshine today across the Central Plains and also out west. Let's take a look at the satellite photograph this evening, and you can see the cloud bands now associated with that cold front that is pressing toward the Atlantic coast. The clouds now through central South Carolina up through North Carolina. Still some light rain showers of the extreme northeast, but most of the heavy thunderstorms are out of the way. Clear skies back through Texas can be seen, and a few clouds moving in over the northern plains, but no rainfall occurring there yet. Out in California, skies have been clear today and warm temperatures. Even the northwest, who we thought this time yesterday would have some rain, cleared up, and things were pretty nice there. On the East Coast, you can see the rain and thunderstorms over central Florida, but not too many, and the cloud pattern in the northeastern part of the nation. Let's go to our special color radar system now. We're watching the National Weather Service radar facility for the Washington, D.C. area. And notice, here's Baltimore, this is New Jersey, and this is Richmond, Virginia. All of the rain showers have moved off to the east, and it looks like let's flash the heaviest rainfall now and see exactly where it is. Most of the heaviest rain has now moved offshore and continues to move to the east. Skies are clearing up a little bit behind the front, but I think tomorrow, as this next area of low pressure comes through, skies will be clearing. It will be windy and turning considerably cooler over the northeastern part of the nation, and we should have partly cloudy skies all the way through the south central states and out in the west. That's it from the Weather Center. Now back to the news desk.
Thanks very much, Dallas. We're still standing by expecting President Carter to concede this election to Ronald Reagan momentarily. We'll have more election returns coming up when Prime News 120 continues.
And we'll also have a report from Dallas where angry drivers are reportedly maiming the others. We'll have that and much, much more right after this. The Chrysler Corporation says it will recall over 600,000 Omni and Horizon subcompacts from the model years 1978 through 1980. The automaker wants to correct potential defects in the battery charging system and fuel hoses. Chrysler says it knows of one minor accident attributed to the charging system problem and one underhood fire resulting from fuel leaking. No injuries were reported in either. It was Chrysler's second major recall this year. In March, the number 3 automaker recalled 1 million trucks and vans because of a potential frame problem.
An increasing number of Dallas motorists are using their vehicles to vent their anger. Correspondent Larry Lamott has more.
Dallas is being plagued by a growing number of persons who are using their cars and trucks as weapons. In just over a year, more than 160 people have been assaulted with vehicles.
It's not uncommon to have husbands use a car to attack a wife and vice versa, boyfriend, girlfriend situation, and other relationships that are similar to those. Just seem to be more and more of them doing that kind of thing to, I guess, to act out their aggressive tendencies.
But those are cases that make sense. It's the ones that don't that have police baffled.
We don't understand why there's an increase in people who don't know each other. We have instances in which cars chase kids up onto sidewalks, people being run into and hit by automobiles on, say, shopping center parking lots and things of that sort. And these people don't know each other and have no reason to act that way.
Some psychologists say that playing loud rock music in vehicles may be causing aggression. Others point to the frustration created by driving on very congested streets and highways. One such thoroughfare in Dallas is the Central Expressway, and even Bob Shaw has had some experiences there.
I have seen men exchange obscene gestures from one car to the other. Another one would invite the other one to, pull off the expressway to the service road and, we'll settle this. And I've seen that a number of times in recent years.
The Federal Highway Administration is reportedly planning a study of driver aggression. Meanwhile, the old warning to pedestrians to look both ways before crossing is beginning to take on real meaning in Dallas. I'm Larry Lamott, Cable News Network, Dallas.
As we've been telling you this evening, President Carter has reportedly drafted a concession speech, and we believe that he shall be delivering it within the half hour. That's what we hear from the White House. With 15% of the vote counted, Ronald Reagan leads the president 51 to 43%. And we are going to have all the details and much more with Mary Alice Williams and Bernard Shaw right after this.
We've got more election returns and I believe some word about President Carter. Now let's go immediately to our election center with Mary Alice Williams and Bernard Shaw.
Thank you very much, Bill. Jimmy Carter has gone to that hotel in Washington to make the statement that will doubtless choke in his throat. Let's go up to correspondent Daniel Shore in our Washington bureau.
Yes, Bernie, while we're waiting for President Carter to make what obviously will be a bitter concession speech, to be followed almost immediately, apparently, by a victory statement by Governor Reagan in Los Angeles. And while we're waiting for that to happen, we're gathered again with our panel of commentators who include Stuart Lurie, managing editor of CNN in Washington, Bob Novak, and Roland Evans. And you were saying a while ago, Roland, and maybe you should repeat it for a larger audience, that this isn't just an election, but maybe a revolution of sorts.
Well, the phrase was not mine. I did say that to you, Dan. The phrase came from one of Reagan's Midwest and Southern coordinators, whom I talked to on the phone a minute ago. And he was pointing out that his tabulations show in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, for example, an increase in voting turnout of 10 points over 1976. In Michigan, another politician told me on the phone that the way the blue-collar vote has gone to the polls, not staying home in dismay and anger, but gone to the polls and voted 50-50, almost 50-50 for Mr. Reagan.
So you're
so it's a revolution.
Turnout with the revolution.
That is a revolution in the sense that 30 or 35, 36 years of a kind of politics has been declared bankrupt. This is the argument by the new electorate. They want a different kind of style and economic and less government and more individual rights.
And that's going to be the determination of whether this election is just another one of these rejection of an unpopular opponent. There was no great significance in LBJ beating Goldwater or in Nixon beating McGovern. It was just that the people didn't want Goldwater and they didn't want McGovern. The thing we really don't know tonight is are they just rejecting Jimmy Carter, or is this one of the watershed type elections such as 1932, when the whole ideological framework of the country changes?
Well, let me pick up on that reference to 1932, Stu. It was Ben Wattenberg who was telling me several weeks ago that what we may be witnessing, and he said we have to wait for election night to find out, is the formation of a new coalition. In 1932, FDR managed to create a coalition based on the poor and labor and ethnic groups And maybe that coalition, which has basically dominated the politics of this country from 1932 until today, with obviously some exceptions, may be finally crumbling, and we may be now reassembling a totally new coalition in which the blue-collar workers are now moving into the Republican column, now more concerned about inflation and unemployment, and a series of shifts have taken place of a seismic sort in which we may be seeing a new Republican coalition which would then dominate politics for the next 20 or 30 years.
The interesting thing is that this was not picked up in the polls with any great clarity. I was talking with somebody just a little while ago in the Reagan camp also, who told me that apparently what they had here was millions and millions of closet Reaganites, that was the term that he used, who were afraid to mention the fact that they were supporting Reagan during the campaign, but who just came out of the closet and went right into the polling booths and cast their votes the way they intended to all the time. He discounts the fact that there was this last-minute shift. He said, yes, a few things did not go Carter's way during the last few days.
They were ashamed, in other words,
That's
to come
right.
out. They
That's
didn't want
right.
to admit it. But the thing that amazes me, Dan, and I suppose amazes everybody, is that the Reagan pickup that's so surprising is not just in the Great Lakes industrial states, in those states that were looking 43, 42, 41 for both sides with a few for Anderson. He picked up all those states, but he has also scored heavily in a totally different kind of political complexion, Missouri, South Carolina, Louisiana, etc. It's a sweep, in other words.
Right. Well, it's a sweep, it's a landslide, and maybe has some of the makings of some kind of revolution, perhaps too early to say. Well, we're still waiting for President Carter, and while we're waiting, let's go back now to Atlanta.
Thank you, Dan. More in the Senate. Ronald Reagan's coattails and the moral majority can claim a U.S. Senate victory in Oklahoma. Republican Don Nichols has been projected to defeat Democrat Andy Coates. Nichols was one of the candidates selected by the religious right for the major financial support in the campaign, Mary Alice.
Bernie, I understand that President Carter is now walking into the hall to give his concession speech. Let's cut to Washington and the hall.
You know, one of the things we can look for in the remarks to be made by Jimmy Carter is how he will address Mr. Reagan in terms of tone. Towards the end of this heavily fought campaign, Jimmy Carter was accused of being very mean by a lot of people, and that too may have been a negative factor in his apparent defeat tonight. Will he be gracious tonight? Will he reflect openly, publicly, for everyone on what he views as the reasons for his defeat? Correspondent Mark Walton is there. Mark?
Yes, Bernie, we're down at the Sheraton Washington Hotel, where now the crowd has multiplied in the last couple of minutes by a couple of hundred. On the floor, all of the president's advisors, Stuart Eisenstadt, Jack Watson, people who we can presume now will be pulling out the resumes in the next couple of days. Candy Stroud has been down on the floor talking to Jack Watson, the chief of staff, and I understand we'll have an interview with him and with Eisenstadt later on. The band playing earlier a sad version of Georgia, struck up a little Happy Days is here again. Happy Days are here again, the signs waving, and now coming up onto the stage. Members of the president's staff, Democratic operatives from here in Washington. I believe that's Senator John Glenn down on the right of the stage. He did some campaigning. Treasury Secretary William Miller. Secretary of State Ed Muskie over on the left side. Crowd, willing to admit defeat, not willing to take it sadly. There's a lot of drinking going on in this room in the last couple of hours. It looks like maybe about 500, 600, 700 people in here at the moment. President is definitely in the hotel. He was expected to come out and speak at 9:40 to make what we all understand will be his concession speech. We are told he's in a holding room right now nearby. We're not quite clear on what the delay is. There have been no other speakers here earlier in the evening. The president will be the first one out. Bernie, as you said, this speech will give us a lot of hints about how the president feels about what's happened. Bob Strauss, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, former and chairman of Carter Mondale over this election.
Mark, I suspect that Mr. Carter, one of the things he's done there out of our view is to regain his composure and quite possibly to talk with Governor Reagan. We don't know that for sure, but be assured that Governor Reagan wants to see what we're watching and to hear what President Carter is going to have to say. And, of course, very shortly out there in the West Coast, where correspondent Bob Berkowitz is, we can expect to hear from the governor once he has heard from President Carter. After all, that's the thing to do tonight.
Bernie, while you were speaking, the key man in the decision to make this concession speech this early came on the stage. If you can see him, he's over to the right side of the stage. Pat Caddell, the president's private pollster, standing now next to Ham Jordan, clapping. Caddell was the one, we understand, who early this morning, through his own private polls, as the president returned from Plains, was able to pretty well predict that the president might lose by 7 to 10 electoral votes. That was early on, and of course it looks at this point like it's going to be a great deal more.
Mark?
Caddell has been, yes, go ahead.
Oh, pardon me. Jimmy Carter tonight has been haunted by a campaign theme he used 4 years ago. He said that he was not part of the Washington establishment, and he, of course, has been very much in the woodwork of the Washington establishment for the past 4 years, and now Governor Reagan can make that claim.
Well, it's true, and it's, you know, it's reflected in this room tonight, because in here are not your traditional Washingtonians. You could say that the president, as opposed to other Washington politicians, hasn't spent a lot of time in ballrooms, in big hotel gatherings, other than for formal events. He has not gone out in the town in the last couple of years. That's been a lot of his failure, or perceived failure, has been attributed to his lack of relationship with the Congress, for one part because he was unwilling to be a good old boy and play the games that Washington politicians have been successful and with which they've been successful in doing business over the past couple of years. So there's a lot of irony just in that fact in this room here tonight. Not a lot of old-line Washington-type people, but rather Carter people who've been Carter people all along and pretty well isolated.
Mark, still, it's highly unusual that the president, or in fact any candidate, would make a concession speech before the polls closed. What is the strategy behind this? How does it benefit Mr. Carter to make a concession speech this early in the election night?
Mary Alice, I don't know what their thinking is. I mean, the concession speech clearly comes at this point because they've determined that the key states, that the East Coast states, make it impossible for him to go any further. Why they want to do it this early is yet unclear. Maybe they just feel that they may as well get it over with. The president, we're told right after this speech, may go up to Camp David, and it may allude to something Bernie was mentioning earlier, and that is that at this point, after 8 very tough days, the president is just so exhausted he doesn't want to go any further. Bob Strauss now up at the podium, and Hail to the Chief being played for President Jimmy Carter. Carter and Rosalynn Carter coming up stage right, waving to the crowd.
Carter gave an emotional speech to some friends and longtime supporters in his hometown of Plains, Georgia. His voice broke. There were tears in his eyes as he thanked them for their support and told them that he had honored the promises he'd made to them that were important to him and to them, his friends and supporters. We also understand that it was an emotional ride home on the back to Washington, and we're likely to see a little bit of that feeling tonight.
There is Pat Goodell, Mr. Numbers in the Carter campaign. He's the man who told Jimmy Carter, Mr. President,
ladies, not only the president, but the splendid president of these United States.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt. The people of the United States have made their choice, and of course I accept that decision, but I have to admit, not with the same enthusiasm that I accepted the decision 4 years ago. I might say I have a deep appreciation of the system, however, that lets people make the free choice about who will lead them for the next 4 years. About an hour ago, I called Governor Reagan in California, and I told him that I congratulated him for a fine victory. I look forward to working closely with him during the next few weeks. We'll have a very fine transition period. I told him I wanted the best one in history. And I then sent him this telegram, and I'll read it to you. It's now apparent that the American people have chosen you as the next president. I congratulate you and pledge to you our fullest support and cooperation in bringing about an orderly transition of government in the weeks ahead. My best wishes are with you and your family as you undertake the responsibilities that lie before you. And I signed it, Jimmy Carter. Thank you. Just a minute. Okay, let me say that. Let me say that. Thank you. I have been blessed, as only a few people ever have, to help shape the destiny of this nation. In that effort, I've had your faithful support. In some ways, I've been the most fortunate of all presidents because I've had the daily aid of a wise man and a good man at my side. In my judgment, the best vice president anybody ever had, Fitz Mandel. I've not achieved all I set out to do. Perhaps no one ever does. But we have faced the tough issues. We've stood for and we've fought for and we have achieved some very important goals for our country. These efforts will not end with this administration. The effort must go on, nor will the progress that we have made be lost when we leave office. The great principles that have guided this nation since its very founding will continue to guide America through the challenges of the future. This has been a long and hard-fought campaign, as you well know, But we must now come together as a united and a unified people to solve the problems that are still before us, to meet the challenges of a new decade. And I urge all of you to join in with me in a sincere and fruitful effort to support my successor when he undertakes this great responsibility as President of the greatest nation on earth. Ours is a special country because our vast economic and military strength give us a special responsibility for seeking solutions to the problems that confront the world. But our influence will always be greater when we live up to those principles of freedom, of justice, of human rights for all people. God has been good to me, and God has been good to this country, and I'm truly thankful. I'm thankful for having been able to serve you in this capacity, thankful for the successes that we have had, thankful that to the end you were with me in every good thing that I tried to do. There's an old Yiddish proverb that I've often thought of in the days and months that I've held this office. It says simply, God gives burdens, also shoulders. In all the days and months when I have served you and served this country, you've readily given me your shoulders, your faith, and your prayers. No man could ask any more of his friends. I've wanted to serve as president because I love this country and because I love the people of this nation. Just one more word. Finally, let me say that I am disappointed tonight, but I have not lost either love. Thank you very much.
Jimmy Carter making the concession speech he did not want to make tonight. And while the Carter supporters express their affection for their leader, right now we can just envision Mary Alice and their colleagues in Washington, the foreign embassies in Washington, countries represented with diplomatic representatives, are crackling out perhaps not encoded messages, the fact that it is official. The United States government will change hands in January. It will go from Democratic to Republican. Jimmy Carter has conceded. We have a lot of people out on the field tonight, and we're going to be hearing from them. Any thoughts?
Well, one thing is that you can be sure that Governor Ronald Reagan, now President-elect Ronald Reagan, and independent presidential candidate John Anderson are both watching all of this. Now, Anderson knows that he won't win, but he can lose more than most. Throughout the evening, Anderson's total of the vote has been around 5% of the vote, sometimes dropping down to 4%. Anderson must have 5% of the total of his campaign is to receive millions in federal matching funds. And that's money he needs badly to pay for his last-minute television blitz. Speaking of last-minute blitzes, behind the president during his concession speech was Jesse Jackson was standing. The very last week of the campaign, the former head of Operation Breadbasket went around the country making sure that blacks got out to vote. But there are some tomorrow
There's
who might
Jackson
say
there.
that there's Jesse Jackson
And Watson.
now, shaking hands now with the president. There are some who say that that last-minute effort was too last-minute. There's a lot of talk about traditional Democrats leaving President Carter and then coming back to the fold out of fear of a conservative presidency under Ronald Reagan. But they didn't come back in the numbers needed for President Carter to win.
Mary Alice, I thought it was a gracious speech. Mr. Carter is not going to leave the hotel right now and go quickly back to the White House and sulk. He's going to stay there in this ballroom and talk to his many supporters. The president's tone was very gracious. And he apparently is determined to make certain that when the government changes hands on January 20th in Washington, it will be, as he says, a fine transition. He says, I want the best in history.
Governor Reagan has been all along advised by President Carter's foreign policy advisors on the state of the country. We now understand that our Bob Berkowitz in Los Angeles is standing by where Governor Reagan is expected to make an acceptance speech. And let's go to him now. Bob?
Well, Mary Alice, here in Los Angeles, there's a mood of anticipation. That's about it. This mammoth ballroom you may see in the background over my shoulder, it's filled with reporters, technicians, and the like, but there aren't any partiers here. They haven't arrived yet, and they're not supposed to come here for another hour. Governor Reagan is due at the hotel just about now. It's 7 o'clock here in California, and the partiers, the victory celebrants, will be here supposedly in about 8 o'clock our time. So right now we're just waiting here, and a lot of reporters are milling around. There are indeed a lot of Reagan staff people here, and there are two expressions on their face. One is, as you can understand, an ear-to-ear grin, and the other one is sort of this look of shock. Not that they won, but that they won by such a huge margin. And they're just absolutely stunned by the whole situation. And I've been talking to them, and one interesting set of statistics, I talked to a few of their pollsters, and they said that they won the South with a better vote. I'm talking about white Southern voters, with as good a vote, if not better vote, than Jimmy Carter won in 1976. They won 40 to 45% of the blue-collar vote in the industrial Middle West and Northeast. They did very well with the ethnic voters, running at as much as 5 to 12% ahead of what President Carter did in 1980. So they're running extremely well all around the country. And they said, one of Reagan's pollsters told me that he knew as early as October 17th that Ronald Reagan was not only going to win, but he was going to win by something close to a landslide. It's a tremendous victory, and we're expecting one big party here in just an hour or so. Mary Alice?
Thank you, Bob, very much. Bernie?
We're going to cut away from the election desk and go back to our good friends on the news desk, Kathleen Sullivan and Bill Zimmerman. And when we return, we'll have the view of a former Carter administration official on why Jimmy Carter lost tonight.
This is Cable News Network.
That's it for a rather eventful edition of Prime News 120, this election night 1980. For all of us on the staff, good evening. Freeman Reports is next now from New York. Here's Sandy Freeman.
Okay, coming up on camera, 3 truck left. Okay, roll record machine. Keep trucking. Let me know when next. 3, give me a 2-shot.
I'll fix that.
Okay,
we got about 20 seconds.
Okay,
We are coming to you live from our New York bureau this evening, and with me as my guest I have a gentleman that I have been with the last hour. We have been watching the election returns together. Burns Roper is our guest. He's of the Roper Organization. The Roper Organization in 1976 was the only polling organization that called the election. Everybody else said it was too close to call. Now, Burns, I know this is a terrible thing to do to you, but you made a call this year, too, and it didn't exactly turn out the way you called it.
We didn't make a call this year. I've been very unhappy up till about an hour ago that we didn't have a final poll. Our last poll was October 4th.
I'm referring back to a conversation that you and I had about 2 months
yes.
ago.
Well, then I clearly thought Carter was likely to win. That's right, yeah. In fact, up till a week ago, I thought it was more likely than not.
You were very surprised, though, as you were watching those returns tonight.
Yes.
What surprised you the most?
The size of the vote and how early it happened. I'm not even sure the polls are closed yet in California, and the president's already conceded.
Well, in listening to Bob Berkowitz of Cable News Network, he said that many of the people in Reagan's camp are very surprised at the large amount of voter turnout that they had for Reagan.
Well, I don't imagine there's anyone that isn't surprised, not so much by the fact he won, but by how sweeping the victory was and how early it came.
In some of the other races, were there any major surprise for you on the results that you were listening to so far within the last hour?
On Senate and that kind of thing?
Yes.
Not particularly. I thought, I didn't know which way it would go on the by-Quayle race. I knew that McGovern was in a very tough race. I'm not terribly surprised he lost. I know that, I haven't heard yet on Colorado, I know that Gary Hart's in a very tight race.
Do you see this as a trend? I mean, across the country, it seems that more Republicans are really going to be in the House than was expected.
I doubt
as well.
if they'll carry the House.
You don't think so?
No. I had thought the Democrats would probably lose about 15 votes. This may suggest they're going to lose more like 25 or 30 or something, but that'll still give them a majority.
Why did this happen? Why did Reagan win?
I think, well, I don't know.
And by such a large majority, at least it looks that way at this
point.
point.
One thing, I made a bunch of notes before I came here, and one of the notes I made was that this is essentially an unhappy election. It's an anti-vote. 4 years ago, when we asked people whether they felt they were voting for the better of two good candidates or against the worst of two poor candidates, most people said for the better of two good candidates. When we asked that question this year, we got the exact opposite result.
Well, we heard the lesser of two evils
Right,
for the last
right.
month, 6 weeks.
And I think it was that. Now, why it went so strongly to Reagan, I can only assume based on the change in direction that the polls showed, even if they didn't show it as strongly as this, the change in direction after the debate, that the debate reassured people who wanted to vote against Carter that they weren't running the risk of getting something even worse, and that did it. And I had assumed, our polls have shown that the undecided was much lower this year, not much lower, a little lower this year than 4 years ago, which surprised me a little since people were unhappy with the choice. It also has indicated that the turnout is likely to be higher this year rather than lower, which again surprised me.
Because normally when there's a larger turnout, the vote is higher on the Democratic end.
Right, but I think what this has to mean is that anti-feeling is stronger than, I mean, voting against the guy you don't want is a stronger incentive both to making up your mind and to voting than picking between the better of two nice guys, which is what people did 4 years ago.
Now, the debates have been mentioned, the debate. I don't know that I can say debates because I can't. Right. The debate that happened a week ago. Immediately afterwards, I mean, there were mixed feelings as to who really won the debate. Yesterday and today, in everything that one reads or hears about, all of a sudden the feeling was that Reagan had come out the winner. But that wasn't the feeling right after the debate.
No, one of my partners and I, one that you interviewed as a matter of fact on that women's opinion poll, Shirley Wilkins, and I speculated before the debate happened. What happens if it's a draw? We both agreed if it's a clear win for either person, that is an obvious advantage for that person. But what happens if it's a clear draw? I thought if it was a clear draw, it would make Democrats feel comfortable about going back home.
Right.
Her reaction was entirely different. She thought that what it would do was reassure people who didn't want to vote for Carter in the first place that they weren't making an even worse mistake to vote for Reagan and that it would benefit him. I think it's pretty clear she's right.
What about the money in the campaigns? Because from everything we've read or everything we've heard, Reagan's campaign had a lot more money, not just his campaign, but the outside forces such as the moral majority that were running their own kinds of spots for Reagan. Do you think that the fact that Reagan just had much more money?
No, I don't think so. I think when you get into that amount of money, that isn't it. And Reagan did very well where the moral majority isn't really even a factor. I mean, Connecticut, it's not a big factor, and he did very nicely in Connecticut. New Jersey is not a big factor.
We have to break away for just a moment. We are going to return to Atlanta for the latest election returns. We are going to Atlanta now. And because we will be standing by, I just have found out. You must realize we're doing this as it happens, and I've just found out that we will be going to Reagan headquarters.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Mary Alice, before we go out to Los Angeles and when the governor is in a position to make a statement, just a quickie. Former Budget Director Burt Lance said tonight here in Atlanta that Jimmy Carter was the victim of a public anger over economic and international events that would have swept almost any president out of office.
Right now, Bernie, Ted Casey, President-elect Reagan's campaign manager, is standing by in Los Angeles, and we're going to go to him right now. Ted?
Thank you. We're with William Casey, the chairman of the Reagan Committee. Mr. Casey, does Governor Reagan's victory suggest that America has taken a turn for the political right?
Oh, I think that's a matter of semantics. I think what it suggests is the American public has come around to accept and espouse the views that Governor Reagan has been putting forth over the years. A leaner government, a lighter tax burden, a lighter regulatory burden, a firmer foreign policy, and a stronger defense. Now, if you call that the political right, that's what it is. I think that's just an evolution and an adaptation on the part of the American people to the experience that the other policies, the policy of heavy taxation, heavy spending, and heavy regulation, have brought about an economic depression, has inflicted great economic suffering on this country, has lost its prestige and respect in the world, and put us in rather an unsafe position from a military standpoint.
Mr. Casey, a lot of people, even before the tremendous victory Governor Reagan scored this evening, were saying that this was more a rejection of the way Jimmy Carter has run the country than an acceptance of Ronald Reagan's view of America.
I don't know how anybody makes that distinction. I think that it has been in part a rejection of Jimmy Carter's record, but the American public explicitly accepted and expressed a preference for the policies that Governor Reagan has been espousing, not only during this campaign, but for the last decade or more.
What changes can we expect in our nation in the first, let's say, 100 days of the Reagan administration?
Well, I believe that there will be enough indications to the American public that there will be lighter tax burdens and reduced spending and reduce waste in government to restore confidence in investment and pep up the economy, pep up the economic system and get us moving forward again.
Chairman,
I think it will be a signal to the world that we intend to adopt clearer and firmer policies, and I think that this will result in a restoration of American prestige, and as we build our defenses, why that will again strengthen our role and strengthen the confidence of our allies in our policies.
Mr. Casey, much thanks and congratulations. Now back to Atlanta.
Thank you very much, Bob. If Mr. Casey has popped into your consciousness rather quickly and you're searching around, William Casey, you might recall, is the former chairman of the Security and Exchange Commission, and he is the man that Ronald Reagan brought on board as a troubleshooter when Reagan was having difficulty early on, and we had a couple of those resignations. Another thing to remember, that what you're watching and hearing tonight is being broadcast around the world, and foreign governments will be extremely interested in what Governor Reagan will say when he makes his victory statement tonight. Mary Alice?
It's likely that very shortly we will know some of the people who will be his leading cabinet ministers who will guide this country through the next 4 years. We are, again, waiting for Governor Reagan to arrive at the hotel and make his acceptance speech after what it must look to one Georgian who's occupied the White House for 4 years as though it was like Sherman's March to the Sea. Reagan marched right across the country, leaving President Carter with only 5 states.
We have some messages for you, and after those, Sandy Freeman again in New York City.
Welcome back. Freeman Reports is coming to you live from our New York bureau this evening as part of CNN's election coverage. With us here in New York, we have Burns Roper of the Roper Organization. We've been talking about the election, how it happened, how it seems to be a landslide victory at this point for Ronald Reagan, and how many people are surprised, including his own people. A few moments ago, we were able to see Bob Berkowitz talk to William Casey, who's a troubleshooter for Ronald Reagan's campaign, and he asked him the question, does this seem to be a shift to the right? What are your feelings?
I think it is to some degree. There is no question but what the public is feeling conservative. I think that can be misinterpreted, though, because in the abstract, in general terms, they feel conservative, but you start talking about specifics and they are not conservative. If you ask about, is the federal budget too big, about right, or too small, people say too big. Then you say, well, are we spending too much about right or too little on X? Too little. What about on Y? Too little. What about Z? Too little. Every time you get the specifics, not every time, but
yes,
we did this on 10 major components of the federal budget. People having just told us we were spending too much overall on the entire budget, and they then proceeded to say we were spending too little on 8 of the 10 items in it, and spending too much on only one.
But yet, getting back to it, you said you think this does show a shift to the right.
I think it's a feeling of conservatism. I'm not sure it's going to be matched when you get down to the specifics. For example, ERA. The Republicans don't agree with Reagan on ERA, much less the public at large. Abortion. The public is against an anti-abortion amendment. I don't regard that as conservative. And in Connecticut, you get Chris Dodd rather clearly labeling himself a liberal, running against conservative Jim Buckley, and he wins handily, even though Reagan took Connecticut. I want to see a few more of the Senate races before I make any national generalizations out of Connecticut. But
yes. Some interesting things that we saw happen during this campaign. We saw Ronald Reagan, who had been labeled right, move to the center. We saw Jimmy Carter, who seemed to be in the center, move more to the liberal viewpoint. Do you think that hurt Carter by trying to make that move?
No, I don't think that's it. I think it's much more the Carter record. And I think something that hurt him badly was the sort of meanness and scaredness that showed up both on that closed convention, open convention vote at the Democratic convention, and then in his refusal to debate Anderson.
Also, do you think that Carter has been known for the kind of campaign that he ran this time with Reagan? He did it with Ford in '76, and that was to attack the man. He did it again now with Reagan, all right? Now, Reagan has been attacked before. When Reagan ran for governor in 1966 in California, Pat Brown tried to attack Reagan because he was an actor. And in fact, do we have that commercial? Can we run that commercial right now? This was a commercial that was put on by Pat Brown in 1966 in the state of California, trying to attack Reagan the man, saying that he was an actor, and do you want an actor as governor? To give people, to refresh their minds, and many people across the country probably never saw it.
Yeah.
But to give them an idea of that kind of campaign being waged against Ronald Reagan, and obviously it was unsuccessful then. But can we go back to that tape? Let's go to it right now. This was 1966.
I feel that I have had, well, if I didn't feel that I had had experience that qualifies me to seek this job, I wouldn't do it. Now, mine was not in politics. You wanted law and order in this town. You've got it. I'll shoot the first man who starts for those steps. And here's exciting new Baraxo waterless hand cleaner. Watch. New Baraxo waterless hand cleaner removes the toughest dirt or stains. Gets hands clean and smooth fast, anytime. What a convenience. That's new Baraxo waterless hand cleaner. I see beyond this joint, right through the dirty wallpaper.
Ronald Reagan as the tight-lipped soldier of fortune whose past was a mystery.
Over the years, Ronald Reagan has played many roles. This year, he wants to play governor. Are you willing to pay the price of admission?
Now, that was a commercial that was run in 1966 by Pat Brown's campaign when he was running for governor. And he was trying to say to the people, do you want an actor for governor? In an area where there are many actors. Now, that was the reason why it didn't work in 1966. Why didn't it work this year for the presidency?
Well, I think people think that an actor has as much reason to be president as a peanut farmer. Neither one is exactly the school book grooming for presidency. I don't think people hold a man's prior occupation against him.
But did they hold it against Jimmy Carter because he tried to attack him for that?
I think he hurt himself with that. I think he hurt himself in 72 with that. He started out with something like a 15 or 18 point lead on the 1st of September, and he squeaked in by just a little more than 2 points.
In 76.
In 76.
Yes. Well, what about Anderson? Who did he pull away from?
Well,
for the people who voted for Anderson, did they pull votes away from Jimmy Carter or from Reagan, or did it differ in different areas?
We've done 4 consecutive polls in which we have tried to get at that. If Reagan should drop out of the race, then who would you vote for? Asked of Reagan voters. And we have shown Reagan pulling almost equally from both, Anderson pulling almost equally from both Carter and Reagan. I can only assume that since the Anderson vote dropped so much below what all the polls did, which is incidentally one thing I did expect, was that the Anderson vote would pretty much disappear.
And why did you expect that?
Because third-party candidates normally do that when it comes right down to it. People decide it's unrealistic to vote for him. He really has no chance. This has happened with practically every third-party candidate I can think of. But it seems to have benefited Reagan, because Reagan's lead looks like it's going to be, I'm talking popular vote now, not electoral vote.
Yes.
Looks like it's going to be larger than the most favorable poll to him showed. And that would suggest that Anderson vote went to Reagan more than Carter in the closing days. But
we have to break away for just a moment. We'll be back, coming to you live from New York with our guest Burns Roper right after this.
The presidential race has been run and won by Governor Ronald Reagan of California, but there are still Senate and House races that are very important and may change the face of Congress. Nearly half the chairmanships of all the standing committees in Congress are up for grabs tonight. We do have some totals right now coming in. Bernie?
In Alabama, former Navy Admiral Denton appears to be still holding on to that lead over Folsom with 51% of the votes we see on your screen, and that would represent an upset in Alabama.
In Florida, it's a very close race. Gunter is leading with 51% of the votes to Hawkins' 49%. That is just about as close as you can get. It's Republican Paula Hawkins, who is one of the many women candidates who are running this year.
Here in Georgia, Herman Talmadge is far ahead of Mr. Mattingly. Talmadge having had some problems on Capitol Hill with campaign funds and the several $1,000s in the coat pocket. Apparently that was not a negative impact in that race tonight here in Georgia. Mr. Talmadge out in front, 212,000 votes to Mattingly's 136 votes, 36,000. We should tell you there are 34 Senate seats being contested tonight.
In North Carolina, Morgan is leading 51% of the vote to East with 48% and 1% to other candidates.
In North Dakota, returns are very slim coming in right now. Not too much to make a basis judgment right now, but Andrews has 14 to Johansson's 8.
Nothing again. As we mentioned earlier, the cabinet is becoming a very important situation now for Reagan to try to figure out, and his senior aides, as I mentioned earlier, will say Reagan will seek to broaden his base of support by recalling officials of past Republican administrations and dipping into moderate ranks to fill the top-level posts. CNN Washington has now learned that Senator Henry Jackson of Washington almost certainly will play a major role in the Reagan administration. Also expected to receive a high appointment is Richard Stone, Florida's Republican senator who was defeated in the primary. Another well-known Washingtonian is to be named is Edward Bennett Williams. Williams is a very well-known attorney who served as one of the leaders for Ted Kennedy for President movement. Williams is also the owner of the Washington Redskins professional football team. Observers note that it would be rare and impressive recruitment to secure the services of Williams and Jackson.
Don, we're going to check in now with our Los Angeles Bureau because there are still a lot of races out west that are undecided. Let's go now to Lou Waters.
Thanks, Marcia. Democrats, understandably, in California are not happy tonight. In fact, some of them, the politicians, are complaining rather bitterly about President Carter's early concession. San Francisco supervisor Harry Britt called it a stupid move. He said the early concession speech made it tough on every Democrat in California. Everyone, that is, it appears, except Senator Alan Cranston, who was on the GOP hit list. He defeated quite handily tonight Paul Gann, who is a tax reformer here in California, and as you may know, is a co-author, and the man who worked on Proposition 13, the tax reform measure here in California. Following Senator Cranston's acceptance speech tonight, Governor Jerry Brown took the opportunity to appear before the state's Democrats and, as best as he could, gave the most optimistic forecast of the future here in California.
We've got some rethinking, some rebuilding, and certainly this is a sad day for all of us. But I think we have to candidly admit the fact that it isn't just President Carter's loss, it's all of our loss. And now, in a very joint and unified way, we have to build our party right here in the state, become as strong as we can to rejuvenate this nation, work with a new president. When he's right, agree with him. When he's wrong, provide a loyal opposition. But most importantly, provide the unity and the new direction that will support Alan Cranston, support our congressmen, our assemblymen, and our senators, and build a very strong state and a strong nation. Thank you very much.
Governor Jerry Brown of California, who defeated Jimmy Carter in the 1976 California primary and who bowed out early in the 1980 race, now taking on the job of rebuilding California's Democratic Party. Representative Robert K. Dornan, the Republican from Santa Monica, California, and a controversial conservative former broadcaster, tonight apparently swept to his second straight victory over Democrat Kerry Peck. That was in a hotly contested race. And some other interesting developments tonight in California. The voters here have overwhelmingly voted in favor of easing property taxes for homeowners who install solar energy systems. And California voters have turned down a hotly contested anti-smoking initiative that would have eliminated, or would have established, rather, no smoking areas in public places. That same proposition, or initiative rather, called Proposition 5 in 1978, was also handily defeated. An interesting note, based on early returns out of Arizona, the father of that state's GOP party and the man who, in effect, gave Ronald Reagan his break in the Republican Party is trailing. Tonight, Senator Goldwater had earlier on in the year indicated that he would like to retire. He was urged, however, by his Senate colleagues to stay in the race for fear that Goldwater would lose that race to a Democrat. And as you know, the GOP party is trying for and is getting very close to controlling the U.S. Senate in tonight's election. The Democrats, however, have maintained their Hawaiian seat. Senator Daniel Inouye was re-elected tonight. We'll have more from the West Coast as events merit. Now back to our election desk in Atlanta with Don Miller and Marcia Ladendorf.
Thank you, Lou. Well, we'll have a look at the Senate races in just a moment when we come back, and there's quite a host of them as well, so stay with us. Well, as I mentioned just before we went to the break, we do have a host of Senate races to offer you now, starting off with Alabama. We have Jeremiah Denton, the retired U.S. Navy admiral, who won over Jim Folsom, Jr. He's the 31-year-old son of former Alabama Governor Jim Folsom. Folsom was favored to win. We're going to skip Alaska for now and go to Arizona. Senator Barry Goldwater apparently has gone down to defeat at the hands of Bill Schultz. Schultz, a millionaire real estate developer, spent over $1 million, according to our reports, in the race to defeat Barry Goldwater, who was considered vulnerable before the race began as well. In Arkansas, Senator Dale Bumpers is running in his second term, and he defeated Bill Clark, the Republican. Bumpers, by the way, was running, as we mentioned, for his second term, extremely popular, and those coattails could have could prove useful, could have rather proved useful to Carter. Of course, that goes down the drain now. In California, Senator Alan Cranston has defeated Paul Gann. Cranston had a huge lead in the polls, popularity and otherwise. Gann, if you don't know, is the co-author of Propositions 13 and 4 to cut taxes. Most analysts say tax-cutting fever in California has now run its course, and that may be an indication that indeed it has done that. In Colorado, Gary Hart was once considered one of this year's most vulnerable incumbents. He did win out over Mary Estelle Buchanan. She was Colorado's Secretary of State, and it was thought that she could score an upset and be part of the new class of women senators. That did not happen. Gary Hart beat her out. In Connecticut, Christopher Dodd won out. Christopher Dodd, by the way, Senator Abraham Ribicoff took over for, he took over for him. Dodd looked like the favorite early in the race, and he indeed did come out over James Buckley, the former U.S. Senator from New York, who's now running in Connecticut, as we mentioned. In Florida, incumbent Senator Richard Stone was running. He was defeated in the primary, rather. Bill Gunter is defeated by Paula Hawkins, as you see here. Paula Hawkins, a Republican, and the Grand Old Party had a fair shot to win even before the voting got underway, according to analysts. In Georgia, Senator Herman Talmadge, running for a 5th term, won out over Mac Mattingly. Mattingly had mounted a very strong campaign. He's a former state Republican chairman. Talmadge last term was stung by scandals over the use of office expense accounts for personal items and his admitted alcoholism. In Hawaii, Senator Daniel Inouye, comfortable incumbent, and still is. He beat out Cooper Brown of Honolulu-Ati. By the way, Inouye was so sure of winning, he was campaigning as well, mostly for Carter. In Idaho, Sims beat out Church. That's Stephen Sims, the Republican, over Senator Frank Church, who was the incumbent Democrat. It was being billed as a close race, in fact, the race of the century as we have it in Idaho politics, and Church is fending off, conservatives in Idaho who thought he'd lost his touch and his liberalism of a so-called endangered species. In Illinois, Alan Dixon comfortably beat out David O'Neill, the Republican for that seat. The incumbent Senator Adlai Stevenson III retired, or is retiring after this term. In Indiana, a rather surprise defeat for Senator Birch Bayh. Dan Quayle, a young newcomer, relatively so, a U.S. congressman from Indiana, beat out the senator. Birch Bayh has never had an easy time winning elections. His opponent ran on Time for Change platform, and it obviously paid off for the Dan Quayle, a U.S. congressman from Indiana. Marcia, you've got some more results.
Taking a look at Iowa, we see that incumbent has lost to his challenger. That is Grassley over Culver. John Culver wanted a 2nd term, running against ultra-conservative Grassley, who is a U.S. congressman from Iowa, and it was a pretty tight race. In Kansas, take a look at that. We see that Senator Robert Dole is going to see it says Cole on your screen, but that should be Dole, and he's going to have his 3rd term in the Senate. He ran against John Simpson, who was a little-known former state senator with very little money and apparently a slim chance. Going on into Kentucky, we see that Senator Wendell Ford beat Mary Louise Faust, one of an increasing number of women who are running for political office these days. Ford has campaigned hard, or did campaign hard, and he was pretty popular. A lot of people said he was a sure winner. Mary Louise Faust, on the other hand, is 70 years old, former state auditor, wasn't very well known, and she didn't mount much of a campaign because she didn't have much money. In fact, I think she made a promise as she went into the race that she would only spend $100 on her campaigning. Moving on to Louisiana, where Senator Russell Long was running unopposed. In Maine, that race is kind of close to call. Actually, there is no Senate race in Maine. There was a House race, and still it has not been determined. Maryland, let's move on to Maryland, where Senator Charles Mathias won over Edward Conroy. Mathias was favored to win despite his liberal views, and he had the endorsement of AFL-CIO. And apparently during the campaign he refused to come out for Reagan, even though he is a Republican. Edward Conroy is a state senator and more conservative than Mathias on many issues, and he apparently couldn't get his conservative feelings to get him into office. In Missouri, incumbent Eagleton will serve another term. He won over Gene McNary. And in Nevada, the incumbent Laxalt over Gojak. Senator Paul Laxalt was considered safe, and he was Reagan's campaign treasurer and key advisor. Mary Gojak was a former state senator. Moving on to New Hampshire, Senator John Durkin was beaten by Walter Rudman, a former state attorney general and activist in setting up Consumer Protection Agency and opposing gambling. In New York, a surprise to a lot of people who've been watching that race closely, Senator Jacob Javits had run on a liberal line, and when he lost, originally when he lost his party's backing in the primary, he decided to run anyway. A lot of people thought that Elizabeth Holtzman would win, but she did not. Alphonse D'Amato won instead. He upset Javits in the primary by saying he's too old and too liberal. Moving on to North Carolina, Senator Robert Morgan beat John East, who is a college professor. Morgan is going to his second term now. He was targeted by new right groups and by Republican senior Senator Jesse Helms. In North Dakota, Republican Senator, Congressman Mark Andrews has won the seat there. He was considered unstoppable, and apparently he was. In Ohio, Senator John Glenn, highly favored to win, and when he did, over State Representative James E. Betts. And in Oklahoma, it was Nichols over Coates. Now, Andy Coates was a former district attorney for Oklahoma City, and the Republican Don Nichols was a state senator. In Oregon, the incumbent Senator Packwood over Kulongoski. That's a name for you. He was a state senator. Senator Packwood was spending lots of money, and there were some charges during the campaign that he was trying to buy the election. Don?
Well, in Pennsylvania, Marcia, as you can see, Specter beat Flaherty for the Senate seat there. Specter and other also ran for the Senate. Governor and Mayor of Philadelphia, both candidates were tough campaigners and well known, and there was no clear favorite before the vote began, but as you can see, Specter did emerge the winner. In South Carolina, we have Senator Ernest Hollings. Hollings won the last two elections by landslides. No one expected any different this time, and Marshall Mays went down to the defeat. He's a former state Republican. In South Dakota, Senator George McGovern knocked off by James Abnor. He's the Abnor is the four-term U.S. congressman. He had lots of money from the new right of the Grand Old Party, and says he'll reflect the votes of South Dakotans, and did, overcoming George McGovern. McGovern was in the race for his political life when he lost. The polls earlier showed no clear favorite. He was 25 points behind in last summer's polls, however, and obviously losing more support as time went on. In Utah, Senator Jake Garn overcame Dan Berman. Garn, a Republican, campaigned hard with a solid lead, one of the leading new right senators with 100% rating from most Americans for constitutional action. In Vermont, Senator Patrick Leahy, first Democratic senator for Vermont ever, was elected in 1976, has a liberal voting record, but is big on agriculture and lots of trips back home. He was favored before, Ledbetter, of course, going down to defeat at the hands of Patrick Leahy in Vermont. Over to Washington, Senator Warren Magnuson went down to defeat at the hands of Slade Gorton, the Republican. Gorton, the Attorney General of the state, his campaign had suffered from lack of funds early in the going, but he wouldn't take any from the PACs. He called fat cats, and he wins out at any rate over Warren Magnuson, the Senate's senior member, who was thrown on the defensive earlier in the campaigning by charges that he has been a big spending responsibility for inflation and so on. In West Virginia, we have Nelson over Caston. Nelson, the Democrat, had the edge when they went in. People believed there would be an upset. Kasten, going down to defeat the Republican and former congressman, had earlier charged that there was a Nelson gap, a gap that he says existed in Wisconsin and voters in Washington. At any rate, we'll be back with more results and more news immediately following these messages. Stay with us.
Checking the news headlines at 8 minutes before the hour, Ronald Reagan wins the presidential election in a landslide while Jimmy Carter concedes defeat even before polls closed in 10 states. The Democrats are fighting to retain their Senate seats. The Republicans need a net gain of 9 seats to capture the Senate for the first time in 26 years. The Republicans have picked up 4 seats already and have a good shot at 7 others. Convicted mass murderer Charles Manson is denied parole for the 3rd time. Manson was sentenced to death in California in 1971 for masterminding the murder of 9 people in Los Angeles. When the California Supreme Court ruled capital punishment illegal, Manson was sentenced to life imprisonment. Well, the 52 Americans have begun their 2nd year in captivity, and negotiations between Iran and Washington seem to be dragging. While the diplomatic haggling continues on Tuesday, militants commemorated the 1st anniversary of the embassy takeover, shouting anti-Carter slogans. The militants allowed thousands of anti-American demonstrators onto the embassy grounds. This was the first time that the embassy has been open to the public since its seizure 1 year ago. Apparently, the protesters did not see the hostages. The U.S. has rejected Iran's demand for an immediate public response to its conditions for the hostages' release. The State Department said that it won't rush its reply, and when the U.S. does answer, it will be through private diplomatic channels. For more on the State Department's position, here's Andrea Stroud.
The State Department has not yet formally replied to the official text of Iranian demands, which arrived at the State Department Monday. But spokesman John Troutner told reporters that just having received that document is an event of major significance. He called it a watershed.
The new element in that situation is that we've received a formal document from Iran, and we are now going to be in the process of looking at it and communicating with them our response. We're in a new phase only because we have a formal situation with them now, which we are now seeking to move on, to act upon.
The spokesman admitted that the 4 proposals are essentially the same as those outlined by the Ayatollah Khomeini on September the 12th and those promulgated by the Parliament on Sunday. And although the U.S. has had essentially 2 months to consider the 4 points, they require further study and analysis, he said, because this is the first time there is something official upon which to act and make judgments. Troutner said the U.S. still would prefer an open channel of communications with the Iranians to discuss the various problems involved with the 4 points, but said there are still only indirect contacts and no negotiations. There was no formal response to a note from Iran delivered by the Algerian ambassador to Assistant Secretary of State for Middle Eastern Affairs Hal Saunders. According to reports from Tehran, the note asked for a swift U.S. reply to the Iranian demands through the media. Troutner did not rule out that the U.S. has sent other messages since Sunday asking for clarification of the Iranian parliament's 4 points. Troutner confirmed Secretary of State Muskie has postponed his scheduled trip to Latin America Thursday in order to be on hand as the documents are analyzed, but he would make no prediction when the study phase would end. There is no time frame, he said, although he did not rule out the possibility that there could be a formal U.S. reply before the end of the week.
Well, Iraq's President Saddam Hussein says that he's prepared for a long war in the Persian Gulf, but Hussein offered to withdraw his troops from Iran tomorrow if Tehran fully recognizes Baghdad's territorial claims. Hussein says Iraq has claimed no part of Iranian territory, only land that rightfully belongs to the Iraqis. No reaction so far from Iran, but Iran has been demanding full withdrawal of Iraqi troops before any peace talks begin. According to reports from Baghdad, Iran is taking a beating in battles around its oil capital of Awaz and at Abadan, which is the site of the largest refinery. Iraq claims to have overrun Awaz and completely surrounded Abadan. Iran, in turn, reports a battle in which Iraqi commanders executed their own men for reluctance to fight. Tehran also says that its forces, quote, destroyed Iraqi infantry numbering nearly 600 soldiers near Disfoul. Well, the European Common Market is neutral in the war between Iran and Iraq. However, British diplomats say that the market's foreign ministers have agreed to lift economic sanctions against Iran once that the American hostages are freed. They would not speculate on whether that means that the countries would start selling arms to Iran, but they said that the result of Tuesday's presidential election might play a role in deciding the market's next move. Last month, Iraq asked the community to intervene in the war and help negotiate an end to the fighting. The community refused, saying that the moment was not yet right. Well, a man who says that he's a professional negotiator says an important part of negotiating is knowing when such things as when the right moment is right. He says, in fact, that people negotiate almost all the time in everyday life and often do not realize it. Correspondent Larry Lamott reports.
The word negotiation has become America's middle name, whether it be in labor disputes or hostage deliberations.
Negotiation is a process, and in its simplest and most expansive terms, it is a process whereby two people come together with the intention of changing a relationship.
Richard Zief is a New York attorney with the Negotiation Institute. He says people negotiate on a daily basis, husbands and wives, teachers and students, but often have limited techniques, which were primarily learned as children, one being the temper tantrum.
You know, you watch them very carefully. They pound on the table. The more excited they get, the higher the fist goes. You watch the face gets very red. Watch it carefully because it gets a little blue when they can't catch their breath. The only thing that they're sparing you, that they didn't spare their parents, is lying on their backs and waving their hands and feet in the air. People act like children. We carry out the patterns of that which worked for us early in life.
Zief says we humans are generally insensitive, usually thinking in terms of our own needs, our own desires. But the art of negotiation means finding out what the other person's needs are and how they can be met. To do that, people must carefully listen to one another.
We're terrible listeners. Every kind of test indicates that in a negotiation process, out of all the information that is available to you, all you're finding relevant is about 27%, rounding it off 30%. So what I'm telling you, your mythical person, by not being a sensitive, aware listener, is losing 70% of what the other person is trying to tell them.
The negotiation specialist emphasizes that listening involves watching a person's body language. For example, by paying attention as you talk, it isn't difficult to tell when someone is no longer listening to your side of the story.
When we see the body begin to move in distractive ways, boredom, doodling, looking away, being caught in not being able to answer some particular question.
Zief says the object of negotiation is learning where the other person is coming from. And that, he says, has been the difficulty in dealing with Iran, because their customs are so different from ours. But as an expert negotiator, Zief believes the hostage crisis is about to come to an end. He says we now know Iran needs money and spare parts to fight its war with Iraq. By identifying those needs, we have a basis of negotiation. I'm Larry Lamott, Cable News Network, Dallas.
And coming up next on the News Channel, more late election returns. Well, the 1980 election is over, and Americans solidly supported Ronald Reagan for president. The final results, though, of many state and congressional races are still filtering in. And with an update, here is Don Miller and Marcia Ladendorf at our election desk.
They certainly are, Marcia. The votes are coming in, and you have some late tallies for us.
I sure do. Well, the vote continues to come in at this hour, as we said, and it continues to add to the stunning totals won in this 1980 presidential election by Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter. We're going to take a look now at the latest figures and the electoral tally. This is what we have, the latest figures, 76% of the precincts reporting. Reagan has 51% of the popular vote. Carter has 42%. Anderson now has 6% again. In the electoral votes, this is what it looks like. Carter with 59 electoral votes, Reagan with 469, far above the 270 he needs to win the presidency, and Anderson with no electoral votes.
Well, the Republicans have won 2 governorships and are leading in 2 others at latest report. Here's the way it went in the battle for the control of the State House tonight. Republican Christopher Bond won the Missouri governorship today. He defeated Joseph Teasdale. Governor John D. Rockefeller III won re-election to his 2nd term in West Virginia, defeating former Republican Governor Arch Moore. North Carolina's James B. Hunt defeated Republican Beverly Lake, while in Washington State, Republican John Spellman, a strong conservative, defeated James A. McDermott for the governor's chair in that state. In Arkansas, Republican Frank White is ahead, but just barely, of Democrat Bill Clinton. In New Hampshire, good news for the Democrats as Governor Hugh Gallen defeated former Governor Meldrum Thompson, while in Montana, Democrat Ted Schwinden beat Republican Jack Ramirez. Marsha?
And on in Utah, Democrat Governor Scott Matheson defeated Republican Bob Wright. That's the 2nd term for Matheson. So the Republicans have closed the State House gap. The Democrats now have 29 to the Republicans 21. The fight for the State House is particularly important at census counting time. State legislatures will convene next year to begin reapportioning the congressional districts, and the person in charge at the State House can make a difference there.
And we'll have more election returns and the latest results on CNN when the news channel continues. Stay with us.
It's a little bit past 3 o'clock in the morning here in Atlanta, and that means it's a little bit past midnight in Los Angeles. California votes are still being tallied at this hour, and CNN's Lou Waters is in Los Angeles keeping up with those figures. Lou?
Thanks, Marcia. You're right. We have a little bit more to work with now as the votes are being counted. The voter turnout in California was not what had been anticipated. 77% turned out. The state attorney general had predicted maybe 79%. At that would have been one of the lowest turnouts in a presidential election since 1924. And earlier this evening, and it bears repeating, that many of the California voters found out that President Carter had conceded the election before they had a chance to vote. They left the polling places without casting their votes. Democrats in the state are saying President Carter's concession hurt Democrats here. It did not hurt Alan Cranston's bid for a 3rd term. He was reelected over tax reformer Paul Gahn by a rather substantial margin. Cranston has usually run against rather flawed opposition, according to political observers, and Paul Gahn was regarded as an ineffective campaigner here in this state. We also have results of a San Diego congressional district. A veteran GOP Representative Claire Bergener just overwhelmed her opponent, and that was Tom Metzger, the self-avowed white supremacist. 84% for Claire Bergener. GOP State Assemblyman Eugene Chappie appears to be riding the Ronald Reagan Express to Washington with a commanding lead over Democratic Representative Harold Johnson in the 1st Congressional District. In the 5th, Republican Dennis McQuaid has a slight edge at this hour over incumbent John Burton of San Francisco. Incumbent GOP Representative James Corman is in another close race against the anti-busing leader of California. Her name is Bobby Fielder. They did battle a couple of years ago. They're doing it again tonight, and it's too early to tell how that's going to turn out. GOP Representative Robert Dornan of Santa Monica has defeated for the 2nd time his Democratic challenger, Kerry Peck. So it appears that the Republicans are doing well here in California, and as more of the returns become available, we'll have more information for you. I'm Lou Waters in Los Angeles. Now back to the election desk with Marcia and Don.
Thank you, Lou. Well, all the polls that indicated the 1980 presidential race would be a cliffhanger. It was not. We know now, of course, that Ronald Reagan is the winner by a wide margin. He is the winner in every section of the nation. Our CNN election map shows the story as well as any set of numbers. Those states covered in blue are states won by Ronald Reagan. Those states covered in red belong to President Carter. For the president, the disappointing news came very early last evening. Florida went to Reagan, for example, shortly after the polls closed, only minutes after. Ohio soon followed, and with that began the Reagan juggernaut. As polls closed across the nation, state after state, including those Carter had won 4 years ago, went to Republican standard bearers. Jimmy Carter had taken only his native Georgia, Rhode Island, West Virginia, and Maryland, and the District of Columbia. The other 46 states went to Ronald Reagan.
On the House side of Congress, the Democrats did not get the scare they had in the Senate, but there will be some different and new faces on both sides of the aisle. At the top, House Speaker Thomas O'Neill, Tip O'Neill, easily won re-election to a 15th term, and his number 2 man, Jim Wright of Fort Worth, also won. But the number 3 man was defeated. John Bradamus of Indiana went down, whipped by John Hiller. Representative Morris Udall of Arizona was winning easily. However, veteran Democrats reported in trouble tonight were Thomas Ashley of Ohio, Lester Wolf of New York, and Bob Eckert of Texas. In Virginia, 2 incumbents defeated, Joseph Fisher and Herbert Harris. In Massachusetts, liberal Democrat Barney Frank won the seat left vacant by the Reverend Robert Drinan, a priest who was forced to retire by an edict of the Pope.
Well, despite the fact that Ronald Reagan has won a sweeping victory over President Carter, we still have results coming in from the West Coast, from Hawaii, and so on. And Marcia Leidendorf and me, Don Miller, will keep you up to date on those. For now, we go back to regular news programming and Kathy Pepino.
And thank you, Marcia and Don. A reaction from Republican leaders to this evening's returns was predictably jubilant. Bill Brock, chairman of the Republican National Committee, says that the Republican victories in the presidential race, the House and the Senate, show a new coalition forming for his party.
We've gotten so many votes of non-traditional Republicans, people, blue-collar workers, union members. That's fundamentally important if you're going to build a new coalition. The wins all the way down through the Congress to the legislative level. We're making spectacular gains all the way across the board. What the American people have done is to say they can't afford any more of what we've had for the last 4 years. We want jobs, we want to stop high prices, and we want to change. The only way to do that is to elect new leadership.
That was Bill Brock, chairman of the Republican National Committee, speaking in Washington. Well, once the final outcome of the election was no longer in doubt, President Carter didn't waste any time giving his concession speech. Correspondent Mark Walton reports from Washington.
It was one of the earliest concession speeches in memory. The president so anxious to get it over with that he overruled his advisors who gathered in this Washington hotel and made his appearance before 10 o'clock Eastern Time. There was no immediate congratulation for Ronald Reagan, instead a touch of bitterness at the top.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt.
His familiar smile carried him through the words as he braved the emotion of the moment. While wife Rosalind fought to hold back tears, Carter promised the best transition in history and shared some regrets.
I've not achieved all I set out to do. Perhaps no one ever does. But we have faced the tough issues. We've stood for and we fought for and we have achieved some very important goals for our country. These efforts will not end with this administration.
Later, campaign chief Robert Strauss told us he knew it was all over on Sunday afternoon. The Ayatollah, he said, cast the final straw.
We thought the Ayatollah had accomplished his purpose, I guess, because it really, we were going downward for 3 or 4 days, and on Friday it started coming back Saturday, and Sunday morning we met in my apartment, Pat Cadell and a number of us, and Hamilton Jordan, and looked good. Pat's stuff looked like it turned around a bit. We still were 2 points behind, but we could close that. 2.5, I would say. But then this hostage thing hit, and it brought out all the frustration of America. It just poured out then. Then we started going down 0.5 point an hour, almost.
It all happened so quickly, so suddenly that the tears had no time to flow. Supporters and Carter staff left here in shock. Blank looks on their faces. The finality of it all perhaps is yet to hit home. Mark Walton, Cable News, with the Carter campaign in Washington.
Well, in California, some political watchers are expressing concern about the timing of President Carter's concession speech to Ronald Reagan. CNN's Bryce Zabel reports.
Polls close at 8 o'clock here in California, and of course President Carter made his concession speech with roughly an hour left to vote. At this point, no one really knows what effect that could have on elections out here in the West. Certainly West Coast Democrats are very concerned that perhaps rank-and-file voters will have stayed home, figuring they could no longer influence the presidential election. But of course that same logic and reasoning could apply to Republicans also. So it all adds up to a big unknown factor here, and certainly lots of anxious candidates here in the West. Bryce Abel, Cable News Network, Los Angeles.
And coming up next on the News Channel, the U.S. tells Iran that it must wait for a response to its demands. And it's 17 minutes after the hour, and taking a look at the headlines to the moment, a spokesman for the country of Singapore says that Ronald Reagan's victory in the presidential election reflects a new mood among Americans to make their country strong. Aides to the president-elect say that Ronald Reagan will seek to broaden his base of support by recalling officials of past Republican administrations and dipping into moderate ranks to fill top-level posts. And foreign reaction to the Reagan win is generally positive. The Soviet Union's first report in the election said that Carter lost, not that Reagan had won. And now the news continues. Well, the U.S. has rejected Iran's demand for an immediate public response to its terms for the release of the 52 American hostages. The State Department says that the U.S. would not rush into a reply, and any negotiations would be carried out through diplomatic channels, not through the news media. The Iranian demand came as thousands of Iranians gathered in Tehran to mark the 1 year that Americans have been held captives. The crowd was allowed inside the gates of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, but not inside the embassy itself. The Iranians shouted "Shame on Carter" and "Death to Iraq." Earlier this week, militants who have held the hostages in the Tehran compound agreed to turn them over to the Iranian government. In Pueblo, Colorado, people held a ceremony Tuesday honoring the 52 Americans held in Iran. And among the special guests was the family of one hostage who lives in Pueblo. CNN's James Miklashevsky was there.
The ceremony in front of Pueblo's City Hall marked to the day 1 year since Iranian militants captured the American embassy, seizing 52 American hostages, including one of Pueblo's sons, Billy Gallegos. Bill's mother, Teresa, was the honored guest for the ceremony. Like so many other times in the past year, she expressed hope this would be the last.
I thought by today my son would be home, but we will not lose our faith, and I'm sure that they will all be home with us very soon. I won't name any names because there are so many people that I'm so grateful to, and you know who you are. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Gallegos tied the symbolic yellow ribbons to 2 trees that had been planted in front of City Hall as the town's gesture of hope that Bill would soon be returning home, and that the prayers of the Gallegos family soon would be answered. James Allen Miklashevsky, Cable News Network, Pueblo, Colorado.
Well, the Soviet Union says that the United States will not be able to meet 2 of Iran's conditions for return of the hostages. The Soviet news agency TASS says that the U.S. will not be able to unfreeze Iran's assets and will not be able to return the late Shah's fortune. TASS says that the Carter administration is to blame, and it says that the administration encouraged American businesses, quote, to plunder and squander the money, and now is pretending not to know how much money Iran is deserving. Well, the 45th day of the Persian Gulf War brings desolation to parts of the Iranian oil capital of Awaz. Iraq reports Iran is taking a beating in battles around that city and also at Abadan, site of Iran's largest oil refinery. Iraq claims to have overrun Awaz and surrounding Abadan. Iraqi President Saddam Hussein has indicated for the first time that his country may keep parts of Iran's oil-producing areas if Ayatollah Khomeini fails to turn over control of the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Iraqi television shows people reportedly injured in the fighting at Awaz. Iran, in turn, reports a battle in which Iraqi commanders killed their own men for not being eager to fight. Tehran also says that its forces destroyed a column of Iraqi infantry near the Iranian city of Dizful. Iran says nearly 600 Iraqis were killed in that clash. Well, Iraq formally denies reports of looting by its soldiers during their slow advance into Iran. However, if you go into a fancy Baghdad restaurant, the head waiter might quietly offer you some caviar. Iran doesn't produce caviar, but Iran does. A reporter for United Press International recently went into a state-run Iraqi restaurant and had a quiet conversation with the restaurant's head waiter. Well, the waiter said that he couldn't mention where the caviar came from, but the reporter managed to see that packages of caviar came in, and he says that it was clearly marked product of Iran. In New Orleans, a disgruntled postal worker shot and killed his supervisor with a high-powered rifle. Police say that a security guard was also wounded when he exchanged shots with the man. Police have arrested a suspect, 34-year-old Curtis Collins, minutes after the incident Tuesday night when he went to a nearby hospital. A postal employee says that Collins received a letter of reprimand from his supervisor earlier in the week. The worker said that there were rumors of a personal conflict between the suspect and the victim. Earlier in the week, Collins allegedly slashed his supervisor's tires. Well, Atlanta police say that they are baffled by the lack of motive in the cases of disappearances or killing of 15 black children. And the city is asking for more assistance from the FBI in solving those abductions. But in the meantime, Atlanta schools are doing their part in trying to protect the children. John Sherrick reports.
Every day, twice a day, these first graders put away their readers and pencils for a special lesson from their teacher.
Suppose you're walking home. Do you walk by yourself? No. Must be with a group, right? A group.
All of Atlanta's public schools have been drilling safety lessons into the kids' heads this fall. And at Anderson Park School, kids hear the message every day. For these children live in the southwest Atlanta neighborhood where many of the 15 kidnapping and murder victims first disappeared. They knew 2 of the children who were murdered. They played with them and missed them. The Anderson Park School children now watch out for each other.
See, they're real scared, you know, because it's a lot of our friends have been snatched.
So they understand their teachers' repeated warnings. Older children even say police should push the citywide 11 p.m. curfew back to 8 p.m.
Me, I wouldn't want to go outside to tell you the truth, cause it might be some hooping man in the street trying to kidnap people. It seems to me it don't make any sense.
These Southwest Atlanta kids are realizing perhaps for the first time they live in a dangerous world where not everyone is their friend, and they're willing to sacrifice some freedom for safety.
We want to live.
John Sherrick, 11 Live News.
At least 10 families in the Winston-Salem, North Carolina area who have lost relatives in accidents have received a crude letter saying that their loved ones are in hell. Well, the notes are scrawled on religious stationery with the printed message, "Are you ready to meet God?" Each note says that the family's loved ones are burning in hell and praying for their survivors' repentance. Authorities are collecting the notes from the families, but they say that a formal investigation is not underway because the sender has not committed a crime. Detectives say that it will be difficult to track down the writer. Well, works of artistic beauty are being created at a Philadelphia school by students who will never see the fruits of their labor. Correspondent Judy Dolan reports.
In the movie Rocky, the mythical character ran up these steps at the Museum of Art in Philadelphia. He made the museum a national landmark. But there's a very real scene carried out here every Friday, and except for those it touches, it goes by almost unnoticed. Blind students of all ages are participating in a program to bring them closer to the arts.
I guess the way I learned to make things is by touch, basically, touching my own head and face and touching other people's, and also the sculptures that a person like Rodin has done, or any other sculptor, to get ideas of different facial expressions and different poses of the head type of thing, and then just translating the clay into those ideas.
Cheryl Barr, a 42-year-old housewife, came up with the idea 3 years ago, and the museum, reluctant at first, went along with the idea. The project has been an overwhelming success.
We've had very good results. The people are genuinely interested. They get very attached to the program, to the people in the program. We've got a very good core of volunteers who are very helpful and very devoted to the program. We've had several very talented people in the class. Some of them who protested right to the end that they didn't have anything to give, and were amazed when their pieces turned into something.
The sessions in the studio are lively. Despite their handicap, the students make use of every second available to them. A sighted visitor to the museum came up to us as we were taping this story. She said she had taken her tour of the museum rather casually, sort of going through the motions. But after seeing the blind students' appreciation of art, she'll be coming back a lot more often and paying a lot more attention. This is Judy Dolan for Cable News Network in Philadelphia.
And coming up next on the news channel, more late election results. It's 29 minutes after the hour. Now for a quick look at the headlines to the moment. Iran presses the United States for a quick reply to its terms for the freeing of the American hostages. Poland's Solidarity Free Trade Union formally appeals a restrictive pro-communist law the government is imposing, and the union threatens to strike if it loses in court. And in Germany, Helmut Schmidt will formally be named that country's chancellor later today. Now for news of our own election, let's switch to the CNN election desk and correspondents Don Miller and Marcia Ladendorf.
Thank you, Kathy. And we do have a late senatorial race from Wisconsin, Marcia.
Yes, Don, in one of the closest U.S. Senate races in the country, it appears that Republican Robert Caston Jr. has defeated another major Senate figure, Gaylord Nelson. Nelson was seeking a fourth term. Caston is a former congressman. Nelson was linked with other Senate liberals in the campaign.
And Marcia, the 1980 presidential vote is now over 3/4 of the way recorded, so let's take a look at some of the latest figures now. As you can see, Reagan leads with 51%. The latest United Press International tallies in the national vote for president show that 82% of the precincts are now reporting with that total, 51 to 42% for Reagan over Carter. In the electoral votes cast, 465 went to president incumbent, or not a president incumbent, but rather president-to-be Ronald Reagan with 465. President Carter only managed to capture 35 electoral votes. Anderson still has none. He has 6% of the popular vote, though. He needs 5 to get federal funds to pay for some of his campaign expenses. Reagan, by the way, has won 41 states, as we mentioned, with 465 electoral votes. Carter's won only 4 states and the District of Columbia. We update that now to say 469 electoral votes have gone to Reagan.
On the FBI sting operation known as ABSCAM for Arab Scam Operation was a success from the point of view of congressmen caught on tape and congressmen defeated in today's election. Expelled Congressman Michael Ozzie Myers of Philadelphia was defeated by an independent. Myers is the former longshoreman from the Philadelphia docks who was convicted of taking $50,000 because he became a nationally known figure of sorts when a federal judge released the videotapes showing Myers taking the money and talking about being unhappy over the share he received. Also defeated tonight, Congressman John Jenrette Jr. of South Carolina. Jenrette's conviction in Washington is on appeal. The House has yet to act on whether to expel Jenrette during its lame duck session, which begins later this month. It may be, in the eyes of the members, a moot point since Jenrette lost tonight to Republican John Napier. Congressman John Murphy of New York was indicted on bribery and conspiracy charges. His trial is due to begin in 5 days. Also defeated Frank Thompson of New Jersey, indicted for accepting $50,000 bribe for promising to introduce an immigration bill for an Arab sheikh. He never introduced that bill, however. Also indicted but re-elected Representative Raymond Lederer of Pennsylvania. In Maryland, Congressman Robert Bauman was defeated. The conservative Republican leader in the House is accused of having sex with a teenage boy and is a self-confessed alcoholic. He was considered a shoo-in for re-election prior to the revelation of his personal difficulties. And in Mississippi, Representative John Hinson was re-elected despite his admission of exposing himself to a young man in 1976. We will be back with more on the election, more updates after this word.
Well, President Carter's campaign manager says that as early as Sunday, he knew that Ronald Reagan might score a big victory. Correspondent Mark Walton talked with Robert Strauss last night.
Sunday afternoon, when we got Sunday's polls in and we saw that the hostage thing, that we thought the Ayatollah had accomplished its purpose, I guess, because it really, we were going downward for 3 or 4 days, and on Friday it started coming back Saturday, and Sunday morning we met in my apartment, Pat Cadell, a number of us, and Hamilton Jordan, and looked good. Pat's stuff looked like it turned around a bit. We still were 2 points behind, but we could close that. 2.5, I would say. But then this hostage thing hit, and it brought out all the frustrations of America. It just poured out then. Then we started going down 0.5 point an hour. Oh.
Well, Georgia was one of the few states that President Carter was able to carry in Tuesday's election. But judging from the reaction in one Atlanta bar, not all voters in the president's home state were disappointed with the election results. Marvin Scott reports.
Like most other Americans, Georgians gathered around television sets to learn whether the first Georgian elected president would be returning to the White House or to his home in Plains. Very few people in this bar, a popular gathering place in Atlanta, were disappointed by the outcome.
I am thrilled to death with the outcome of the election.
I don't know. I think we're ready. It's time for a good change. I really do.
My reaction is that I'm very happy. I feel very positive for our nation.
I felt sorry for him tonight. I heard the concession speech, but it's not a Georgian. It's being American. It's not particularly singled out as being a Georgian. It's being American. I think that it's time for a Republican ticket. That's it.
You disappointed President Carter was defeated?
No, not at all. I voted for Anderson.
I am not for Ronald Reagan at all. I think that when he discussed his friend, the Duke, John Wayne, last night on TV, I just thought, surely not. We're not going to put this man in the White House, but here we have, and I'm still a Carter fan. I'm disappointed, and I'm the only one here that is.
Most of the people in here tonight seem to be for Reagan. I didn't hear much hooping and hollering for Carter at all.
Obviously, the patrons of this bar don't reflect the opinion of most Georgians. After all, Georgia is one of the few states Jimmy Carter did carry. As for those Georgians who are upset over the outcome, well, they don't really feel that they're losing a president, but simply regaining a neighbor. In Atlanta, this is Marvin Scott, Cable News Network.
Well, about 100 people participated in a rally in San Francisco aimed at trying to keep people from voting. Dwight Casimir has that story.
This group of demonstrators at San Francisco's Federal Building is protesting the fact that people voted at all today. They're a coalition of groups who believes that neither of the candidates offers a clear choice to the voters. The protest of about 100 demonstrators had all the overtones of the 60s. There was even a folk singer.
The by nature is imperialism's way. I'd rather cope with Dracula any day.
Leaders of this group say their message is a serious one, though. They're fed up with the political system, and they feel that people should have rejected it by not voting at all.
You want politics, you got to take theirs. You got to take their savior. You got to basically be limited to that. Today we're breaking with that. We're challenging that, and we're challenging people to step forward, to act in a historic way.
San Francisco police in full riot gear watched the protest from across the street. When the demonstrators began to march from the Federal Building to the Bank of America headquarters in downtown San Francisco, the riot police followed. Well, essentially what you have here is a 60s type demonstration. In fact, some of the people here were involved in demonstrations at that time. We have police ready for riot activity, but there doesn't seem to be any of that kind of activity here. But it does give an indication of the kind of sentiment by some people who were not voting in San Francisco today. Dwight Casimir, Cable News.
A 107-year-old woman voted for the first time in Tuesday's general election. Mary Marvich was granted citizenship in June after a long fight. Mrs. Marvich immigrated to the U.S. in 1889 from what is now Yugoslavia, but bureaucratic red tape prevented her from gaining citizenship for 91 years. Her daughter says Mrs. Marvich was thrilled to be able to vote, but the 107-year-old woman relished her right to a secret ballot and wouldn't say which candidate she voted for. And now with some more late election results, we go back to our election desk and Marcia and Don.
Well, we are going to look at the Senate races in just a moment. We do have some late tallies in, hopefully. If we have them up on screen, we'll tell you about those. We apparently do not yet.
There we go. We sure do. The popular vote right now shows 51% for Reagan, 42% for Carter. Anderson still has his 6%. In the electoral vote area, with 270 needed to win, Mr. Carter, 59 electoral votes. Reagan with 469. Anderson has none.
Well, everybody's always interested to know what foreign countries think of the changeover in politics. This democratic system does not quite work the way other countries do, or at least most other countries, and those are the countries that are watching perhaps most closely. For instance, Chinese officials in Peking said they will be scrutinizing the change in administrations to see if relations will chill between China and the United States. The position of China is that We want to work closely with whatever administration is in Washington. That's a quote. In the past, we have worked well with both Republican and Democratic presidents, so they seem to be eager to get it on. However, we will be keeping a close watch on Mr. Reagan's policies, especially on the issue of Taiwan, and that was quite a disruptive issue recently. It's no secret, the quote goes on, that China was angry at Mr. Reagan's campaign promise to restore official ties with Taiwan if he is elected, and he is. Hopefully, that was only a campaign promise and will not be implemented by the new administration. That is quoting again. Just after Reagan's nomination, he angered Peking officials, if you'll remember, by saying he supported official U.S. ties with Taiwan. That's the island China insists is an integral part of China, but Taiwan does not happen to think so.
Well, Don, TASS, the official Soviet news agency, ran a 3-line item today saying, or yesterday that is, saying President Carter admitted his defeat at the 1980 elections. Shortly after that, TASS identified Reagan as the winner, saying, quote, he is so much ahead of his rival Jimmy Carter in the election campaign that the latter, long before the polling stations closed, was compelled to admit his defeat and congratulate the winner, end quote.
And of course, Jimmy Carter spent a lot of time at Camp David with both President Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel, trying to sort out their Middle Eastern problems. The reaction from Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who had at times been testy with President Carter, thanked the president for his friendship to Israel and his great contribution to our society, unquote. His efforts in achieving the peace treaty with Egypt, the underlying cause for that remark. But Begin told ABC interviewer Barbara Walters, quote, I look forward to Reagan's presidency because the Republican winner has spoken clear words about the so-called PLO and the unity of Jerusalem, two of the major issues concerning Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin at this point. Begin also said that he would meet next week, if it is possible, with Ronald Reagan when Begin comes to the United States, and he's coming here on a private visit next week. He insisted Carter was his friend and said that friendship is always friendship, whatever the post of a man.
Well, Don, in Tokyo, the Foreign Minister Masayoshi Ito said, quote, again, Japan and U.S. relationships and friendship will not change. And the Chief Cabinet Secretary and a former foreign minister said he believed Reagan achieved a good understanding of Japan while governor of California. Quote, I hope that against this background, Japan-U.S. relations can be deepened.
We've got little reaction in so far from Canada, the U.S.'s neighbor to the north. The government ministers there have refused comment until final returns are in. And we haven't got any response yet in majority. But New Democratic Party external affairs critic Pauline Jewett said the election of Reagan would mean even worse relationships than we have now. Now, bilateral relations are a matter of benign neglect and a fair amount of indifference. It could become worse, unquote. By the way, the Minister of Energy has warned that if American oil companies do not sell majority shares in their companies to Canadian control, that there will be a nationalization of those companies to take place. Another warning and perhaps forecast of things to come in terms of relations with Canada. Fairly cool so far, waiting for the final returns to come in. Well, there will be a lot of senatorial faces gone from this new regime. Among the senators who lost were a group of liberals, including Birch Bayh of Indiana, George McGovern of South Dakota, Warren Magnuson of Washington, John Culver of Iowa, and John Durkin of New Hampshire. So the Reagan sweep has taken some senatorial faces from a group of people we have come to know over the recent years. In Alabama, to take a closer look at what is happening in alphabetical order and down the list, Jim Folsom Jr., a Democrat, he's the 31-year-old son of former Alabama Governor Jim Folsom, went down to defeat at the hands of Jeremiah Denton. He's a retired U.S. Navy admiral and former prisoner of war in Vietnam. We'll have some returns from Alaska and results from Alaska on what happened up there. But for now, Arizona, Senator Barry Goldwater, he's 71 years old, has served 4 terms, was beaten by Bill Schultz, a millionaire real estate developer. Schultz, by the way, spent over $1 million in the race to defeat Barry Goldwater, who was considered vulnerable as well. In Arkansas, Dale Bumpers running for his second term as senator, extremely popular. He won out over Bill Clark. In California, Senator Alan Cranston had a huge lead in the polls before things got underway yesterday rather. Defeated Paul Gann, the co-author of Propositions 13 and 4 to cut taxes. So that, I guess, shows us that most analysts feel that tax-cutting fever in California has run its course. In Colorado, Gary Hart is in over Mary Estelle Buchanan. Hart was once considered one of the year's most vulnerable incumbents, but he now appeared a favorite to win, or at least did just before the elections, and that, of course, has run its course in correction. In Connecticut, Christopher Dodd wins out over James Buckley. Buckley, by the way, former U.S. Senator from New York, ran in Connecticut. Dodd, with Senator Ribicoff retiring, looked like the favorite and was. In Delaware, Governor DuPont, the incumbent, was a sure thing for re-election. In Florida, Bill Gunter went down to defeat at the hands of Paula Hawkins. She was given a pretty fair shot to win on the Republican side of things. In Georgia, of course, Senator Herman Talmadge, Democrat, he's running for his 5th term. The last term he was stung by scandals over the use of his office expense account, personal items, and the furor over his alcoholism, which was admitted. Mac Mattingly went down, thought he had a good chance to win, but of course was defeated by Herman Talmadge. In Hawaii, Daniel Inouye, no problem. He was a comfortable incumbent anyway. He was very sure of winning his campaign, beat out Cooper Brown of Honolulu Ate. In Idaho, Senator Frank Church was billed to be the favorite. Republican Stephen Sims, a current Idaho congressman, came through to take a Senate seat there away from Senator Frank Church. In Illinois, Alan Dixon won out over David Neal. That's David O'Neill. He's the Illinois Lieutenant Governor. Alan Dixon, by the way, the Illinois Secretary of State, now takes a Senate seat for Illinois. In Indiana, as we mentioned earlier, Senator Birch Bayh went down to defeat to young newcomer Dan Quayle. Quayle, by the way, U.S. Congressman from Indiana, and Bayh has never had an easy time winning elections. His opponent, Quayle, ran on a Time for Change platform, and I guess the voters there felt that that was the case. Marcia?
Well, Don, in the same part of the country, in Iowa, Senator John Culver, who was a Democrat, wanted to serve a 2nd term. He won't. Charles Grassley, a Republican, won in that race. In Kansas, Senator Robert Dole, who was a Republican, has won over John Simpson, a Democrat who was a little-known former state senator with no money and slim chances in the race. In Kentucky, Senator Wendell Ford, who was a Democrat, won over Mary Louise Faust, a 70-year-old former state auditor, a little-known and didn't have much of a campaign because she said she lacked money. In fact, she said she only would spend $100 on the campaign. And in Louisiana, Senator Russell Long ran unopposed, so he will see another term in the Senate. And in Maryland, Senator Charles Mathias, who is a Republican, won over Edward Conroy, who was a Democrat, state senator, more conservative than Mathias on many issues. Moving on to Missouri, Senator Thomas Eagleton, Democrat and incumbent, has won another term over Gene McNary, a Republican. Moving on to Nevada, Senator Paul Laxalt, a Republican, won over his opponent, Mary Gojak, a Democrat, former state senator. New Hampshire, Senator John Durkin, a Democrat, is not going to be sitting in the Senate anymore. Warren Rudman, a Republican, and a former state attorney general, won in his race with Durkin. In New York, a 3-way race between Senator Jacob Javits and Representative Elizabeth Holtzman, who's a Democrat, and Alphonse D'Amato, Republican. Alphonse D'Amato is the winner there. It is quite an interesting race since Javits was defeated in the primary and he chose to run on a liberal line in the election, and he didn't win. North Carolina, Senator Robert Morgan, a Democrat, won over John East, who was a college professor and a Republican. In North Dakota, Republican Senator Milton Young was retiring. Congressman Mark Andrews, who was a Republican, will take his place. He beat Kent Johansson, who was a Democratic lawyer and oil broker. He was considered a long shot. And in Ohio, Senator John Glenn, a Democrat, highly favored to win, and win he did over State Representative James E. Betts. In Oklahoma, Andy Coates lost in his race with Don Nichols, a Republican and who was a state senator. Charles Nesbitt was the independent running in that race. He also lost, of course. Oregon, Robert Packwood is Republican, has won the race against Ted Kulongoski, who was a Democratic state senator. In Pennsylvania, Senator Richard Swiker retired, leaving a race for Pete Flaherty and Arlen Specter, and that race is too close to call at this moment. Finally, in Rhode Island, there is no race there, so we go on to Don.
Marcia, in South Carolina, Senator Ernest Hollings, a Democrat, beat out Marshall Mays. Mays, a former state representative. Hollings won the last two elections by landslides, and no one expected him to do any differently this time. In South Dakota, as we mentioned earlier, Senator George McGovern down to defeat at the hands of James Abner. Abner, by the way, a Republican four-term U.S. congressman, spent lots of money on his campaign, and it seems to have worked out over McGovern. McGovern, of course, was expected to be fighting for his political life this time. He lost it. The polls showed no clear favorite before the race began. He was 25 points behind in last summer's polls, however. In Utah, Senator Jake Garn won out over Dan Berman. Berman, a former state Democratic Party executive director, lost out, as we mentioned. Garn campaigned hard. He had a solid lead all the way, and one of the leading new right senators. In Vermont, Senator Patrick Leahy, a first Democrat senator for Vermont ever, was elected in 1976, and he wins out over Stuart Ledbetter, the former banking and insurance commissioner. Moderate concern. We'll pick up the senatorial races in just a moment, but right now we have these messages.
Final arguments were given today during Tuesday in the case against two former FBI agents who are charged with approving illegal spying during the early 70s. Scott Barrett has more.
The defendants, former FBI Associate Director Mark Felt and the Bureau's former Chief of Intelligence, Ed Miller, sat quietly as closing arguments were given. The jury listened, as it has for 8 weeks, to the charges that Felt and Miller criminally conspired to violate the rights of family members of suspected Weatherman terrorists by ordering their homes searched, all without proper warrants, all without the approval of the Attorney General. Prosecuting Attorney John Niels told the jury to lay all other testimony aside and consider the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees the right of privacy to citizens. Defense attorney Thomas Kennelly argued it was 1972 and there were no real guidelines, that black bag jobs, as they were called, were done for 30 years without prosecution, and that it wasn't until 1976 that guidelines were given to the FBI. Kennelly quoted Thomas Jefferson, that to lose the country by scrupulous adherence to the law is to lose that law. Hundreds of thousands of sanitized government documents have been entered into the case. The jury, Kennelly said, must feel like the hostages in Iran because they have been sequestered the whole duration of the trial, some 2 months. It is the belief of the defense that this trial would never have come to be without the cooperation of Judge Bryant. Defense lawyers say any other judge would have thrown the case out, freeing Felt and Miller. And because of that, and the fact the government has spent some $20 million prosecuting the case, defense attorneys believe tomorrow, when Judge Bryant gives his final instructions to the jury, those instructions will not be good for their clients. Up until now, they believe their defense has been persuasive, but they aren't sure what will happen after Judge Bryant talks to the jury about the ground rules the jury must decide the case on. Scott Barrett, Cable News at the District Courthouse in Washington.
Tuesday was the 20th anniversary of the founding of OPEC, but that occasion went uncelebrated because of the war between Iraq and Iran. Both are members of the oil cartel. Iraq was to host a conference marking the 20th anniversary, but that was canceled. And during the conference, the 13-member nations were supposed to fix a long-term pricing strategy for the consumers of oil. Well, the Chrysler Corporation says that it will recall 660,000 Omni and Horizon subcompacts from the model years 1978 through 1980. The automaker wants to correct potential defects in the battery charging the systems and fuel hoses. Chrysler says that it knows of one minor accident attributed to the battery problem. One fire has also resulted from leaking fuel. No injuries were reported. It was Chrysler's second major recall this year. In March, the number 3 automaker recalled 1 million trucks and vans because of a potential frame problem. Well, America's airlines will discontinue their Super Saver fares as of next week. That means that it'll cost more to fly. Correspondent Hank Dolmach explains the cause and the effect of that increase.
Major airlines say their ticket prices have jumped by 50% since the start of 1980. More and more passengers have still been able to save money by reserving seats in advance and getting in on some big discounts that were introduced when the industry was deregulated last year. There will be fewer smiles at the ticket counter after this week, however. At least 4 major carriers are dropping their 25 to 35% Super Saver discounts on flights to many cities. Why have the airlines raised prices and decided to drop the discounts? United Airlines' Sylvia Berry.
The cost of jet fuel has increased 100% this past year.
What does that mean for airfares?
Well, the consumer is going to have to absorb some of that cost, and it will mean that airfares will escalate.
Fuel costs, in fact, are many times higher than they were in the early 70s.
The United Airlines paid 11 cents a gallon for jet fuel, and today we pay about 90 cents a gallon.
With airfares changing so rapidly, if you're planning to fly this upcoming holiday season, the best rule of thumb seems to be look around for the best discount you can find and make your reservations now. Hank Dolmach, 13 News at Norfolk International Airport.
And coming up next on the News Channel, a special birthday for some California youngsters. Well, it was quite a birthday party. There was a couple in Turlock, California, celebrating the birthday of their 3-year-old quadruplets. Bob Weidman reports.
That was Kirsten. How about you? That might have been Gavin. Let's get his picture taken. That's Meredith. And that was probably Trevor. It's easy to get the boys confused, but the girls have different colored hair. The Turlock Quads, as they've been called, came as a big surprise to their parents 3 years ago. Connie Smith had taken a fertility drug and was expecting twins. But 4? Well, they had a birthday party yesterday, although today is their official birthday. And they were wearing new clothes and roller skates, which they seem to have mastered, on the carpet anyway. Connie Smith says the terrible 2s passed without anything unusual happening. But mealtime becomes the biggest problem for parents of quads.
Oh, probably dinner time. Just getting them to make sure they eat some food, and 3 times a day. That's probably hard.
Do they like to eat?
Everything.
Certain things. Certain
real
things.
Food.
Anything that's non-nutritional, I think that's what they like to eat.
Their favorite.
Well, if you can hear me above this concert, now that Halloween is over and their 3rd birthday has passed, the next thing the Smiths have to look forward to is Christmas. And that ought to be a great time around this household. In Turlock, I'm Bob Weidman for Channel 3 Reports.
And coming up next on the News Channel, Marvin Scott continues with the news, and we'll also have late election returns from our election news desk. I'm Kathy Pepino.
Referendum, proposition, unified support, news conference, personal popularity, race for Senate, no clear choice, issues, re-election, emotional issues, campaign issues, moral majority, seniority, second term, favorite candidate.
Ronald Reagan has an overwhelming victory over President Carter in the 1980 presidential election. At the last word, Reagan had captured 436 electoral votes, and that's well above the 270 votes he needed to win the presidency. With just under 70% of the vote now counted, Reagan has 50% of the popular vote, Carter 43%, and John Anderson has 6%. Reagan claimed victory early last night and told a crowd of supporters in Los Angeles that he is optimistic about America's future.
I am not frightened by what lies ahead, and I don't believe the American people are frightened by what lies ahead. together, we're going to do what has to be done. We're going to put America back to work again. You know, I aim to try and tap that great American spirit that opened up this completely undeveloped continent from coast to coast and made it a great nation, survived several wars, survived a Great Depression, and will survive the problems that we face right now. When I accepted your nomination for president, I hesitatingly, but I asked for your prayers at that moment. I won't ask them for this in particular moment, but I will just say I would be very happy to have them in the days ahead. And now just all I can say to all of you is thank you, and thank you for more than just George Bush and myself. Thank you because if the trend continues, we may very well control one house of the Congress for the first.
Our guests tonight are Denise Nicholas, star of Room 222, and now a producer. Comedians Roger and Roger, they crack me up. Actor Leslie Nielsen, star of Airplane and Prom Night. Special effects consultant Jamie Short. Coverage of famed photographer Richard Avedon's opening here in LA, held earlier tonight. It's really exciting. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you, Ed.
Don't mention it.
You're welcome. Don't pad your part. Hello, and welcome to Hollywood. Last night, when we were having a little fun talking about the Nobel Prize winners, I asked you if you could name the 8 Americans who have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and failing that, if you could name the 7 dwarfs. Well, I told you the 8 Americans who won the Nobel Prize, but I didn't tell you the years that they won them in. So for those of you who are wondering, the years were 1930, 1936, 1938, 1949, 1954, 1962, 1976, and 1978. Now compare that to the list you made of the winners last night, and you have everything. Now name the 7 dwarfs. Don't get nervous. This one's name is Huggy, this guy down here. Can you name the 7 dwarfs, Huggy?
Let's see. Sneezy, Dopey, Doc, Grumpy, Bozo.
Manny, Mo, Jack, Ronald.
That's it.
And yes, okay.
Bonzo.
Get him out of here. Scram. Go away. We'll see you later. Bye. Now, last night we were going to show you this, but we didn't have time. A couple of nights ago, they had the 17th annual Hugh O'Brien Acting Awards at the UCLA campus in Westwood. Now, this is something that has been going on for a long time, 17 years, and the awards are given to honor excellence in acting by students in the UCLA, with some of the judges, who included Lucille Ball, Ernest Borgnine, Paul Winfield, and several others. We were able to talk to some of the judges to find out why they were there and what was going on. And as you see, Lucille Ball, as usual, is the center of attention, blowing smoke at Hugh O'Brien. Had a way to go, Lucy.
Kids that were working here and wish that my children had had this. They had experience with me on my show, but I think this was, I don't know, I just think this is great, better preparation rather than on my show, although it did them a lot of good. It showed them where they wanted to go and how they wanted to do it, and they have followed in what they flew off to do, they have done. But I was wishing that they could have this college or Northwestern or some drama classes like these.
This is the first time I've ever had the opportunity to judge them.
Some man in the street trying to kidnap people, and it seems to me it don't make any sense.
These Southwest Atlanta kids are realizing perhaps for the first time they live in a dangerous world where not everyone is their friend, and they're willing to sacrifice some freedom for safety.
We want to live.
John Schierick, 11 Live News.
Don Miller and Marcia Leidendorf will be along with the latest election results and update when the news channel continues. Stay with us. Republican Party Chairman Bill Brock called yesterday a spectacular day for his party. Brock attributed the Republican success to traditional Democrats who turned to Reagan for a change. President Carter's chief of staff, Jack Watson, says Americans bought Ronald Reagan's analysis of the world situation. Watson said Reagan's view is simplistic and will likely change with some experience in the White House. Carter's chief of staff said he thinks the year-long hostage crisis was a strain on the campaign and affected Carter's chances for re-election.
Polling data as recently as Saturday night indicated that the race had closed again to a dead even heat. Depending upon exactly which poll you believe, we were either 1 or 2 points up or Governor Reagan was 1 or 2 points up, but it was a very close race. Something happened to trigger a widening of this gap from Saturday night until today. I suspect that the Iranian hostage situation and the reminder to the American people so vividly on television of this whole year of ordeal may have been at least part of that factor.
Now for the latest returns, we go to the election desk. Here's Marcia Leidendorf and Don Miller.
Marvin?
Marcia, when Ronald Reagan swept the nation last night, he also did something else. He gave the Republican Party control of the U.S. Senate for the first time in 26 years. It was a race for the Senate in Idaho that did it, and in doing so saw the defeat of one of the liberal leaders of the upper house, Frank Church. Church was defeated by Stephen Sims. With 96% of the vote now counted, a vote that was long delayed because of a foul-up in several precincts, Sims has 207,128 votes to Church's 200,389. A third-party candidate has 1% of the vote. Church has long been on the hit list by conservative organizations, and for a state with relatively small population, big political bucks were spent on both sides. So Sims, the Republicans, finally wins, enough to give the GOP control of the Senate and control of the committee chairmanships. That will make life a lot easier for President-elect Ronald Reagan on that side of Capitol Hill. However, the Democrats retain control of the House, which also promises some interesting times for that piece of real estate in the nation's capital. Other very close Senate races we are watching. In Arizona, Republican Barry Goldwater is only a few hundred votes behind Democrat challenger Bill Schultz, with more than 90% of the vote now counted in Arizona. In Alaska, Republican Frank Murkowski appears to be defeating Clark Gurning. And in North Carolina, it is still too close to call between Democrat Robert Morgan and Republican John East. Some 4,800 absentee ballots are yet to be tallied, and that could make the difference.
Well, while we're talking about the Senate races, let's take a real quick look at all of the Senate races that we know about right now. In Alabama, let's see, Denton, the Republican, beat Folsom, the Democrat. In Alaska, as we said, Frank Murkowski appears to be taking over Clark Gruning, and in Arizona, Schultz is leading Goldwater, but Goldwater is closing in at this hour, so we'll have to wait and see on that one. In Arkansas, Senator Dale Bumpers beat Mr. Clark, Bill Clark, and in California, Senator Alan Cranston beat Paul Gann. In Colorado, Gary Hart over Mary Estelle Buchanan. Hart was one of those targeted by the ultra-conservatives, and he held on to his seat despite that. In Connecticut, Christopher Dodd, who is a Democrat, beat Buckley, who was a former U.S. Senator from New York. And in Florida, it was Paula Hawkins over Bill Gunter. In Georgia, Senator Herman Talmadge, a Democrat, maintains his seat with beating Mac Mattingly, who was a Republican. In Hawaii, Senator Daniel Inouye won over Cooper Brown, a Republican. In Idaho, Senator Frank Church, it appears, lost to Representative Stephen Sims, who was a Republican. This was the breaker in in the race we've been looking for who would control the Senate. In Illinois, it appears to be Alan Dixon over David O'Neill, who is Republican. In Indiana, Birch Bayh lost to Dan Quayle. Don?
Well, in Iowa, Senator John Culver, the Democrat, was beaten by Charles Grassley, the Republican and U.S. Congressman from Iowa. In Kansas, Senator Robert Dole over John Simpson. Dole, a mellowed out candidate running for his third term. In Kentucky, Senator Wendell Ford campaigned hard and won out over Mary Louise Faust, a 70-year-old former state auditor. In Maryland, Senator Charles Mathias favored to win and did over Edward Conroy, the state senator, who was a little bit more conservative. In Missouri, Senator Thomas Eagleton's biggest liability, the bad publicity over the extortion trial of his niece, did not affect him. He won out over Gene McNary. He's a St. Louis County executive. In Nevada, Senator Paul Laxalt beat out Mary Gojak. Laxalt considered safe in his GOP stronghold and held on to that safeness. In New Hampshire, Senator John Durkin was beaten by Warren Rudman, the former state attorney general. Durkin's seat was in jeopardy and it was thought to be a very close race. In New York, Alphonse D'Amato over Republican Elizabeth Holtzman, and Senator Jacob Javits, who has been a 30-year veteran, now 76 years old, running on the liberal line, defeated there. In North Carolina, Senator Robert Morgan over John East, Morgan running for a second term, East a college professor. In North Dakota, Congressman Mark Andrews, considered unstoppable, was over Kent Johansson, a lawyer and oil broker, and he was a long shot going into that. In Ohio, Senator John Glenn over state Republican James E. Betts. In Oklahoma, Don Nichols, the state senator, won over incumbent the incumbent senator there retired, Senator Henry Belmont. Andy Coates was running. He's former district attorney for Oklahoma City. In Oregon, Robert Packwood beat out Ted Kulganowski. Packwood spent lots of money, and there were charges that he was trying to buy the election. Well, it seems to have paid off if in fact those charges were true. In Pennsylvania, the Senator Richard Schweiker, of course, retiring, and still a bit too close to call there, actually. Well, I guess we do have an updated on the Republican there, Specter beating Flaherty, the Democrat.
In South Carolina, Senator Ernest Hollings won over Marshall Mays, a Republican. In South Dakota, Senator George McGovern, longtime politician and a Democrat, lost to James Abnor, a Republican. In Utah, Senator Jake Garn, a Republican, beat Dan Berman, a Democrat. In Vermont, Senator Patrick Leahy, a Democrat, won over Stuart Ledbetter, a Republican. In Washington, Senator Warren Magnuson, the Democrat, lost to Slade Gorton, a Republican. And in Wisconsin, Senator Gaylord Nelson beat Robert Kasten, a Republican. Well, the number of ballots cast in the presidential race yesterday are now well over 90% tabulated. We'll have a look at those figures. With 93% of the vote in, we have 51% for Reagan, 41% for Carter, and the margin is very wide in the electoral vote area.
And that's a look at the latest figures we have available. As I say, we'll be cutting in throughout the early morning hours and keeping you up to date on some of the late returns. But right now, let's go back to Marvin Scott on the anchor desk.
Thank you, Don. And we'll have more coverage on election 1980 and a close-up look at our 40th president when we return. Now, for a look at the background of the man, the president-elect, the man who will become our 40th president come next January, here's CNN's Bob Kane.
Ronald Wilson Reagan will become the 40th president of the United States. He'll be sworn into office in ceremonies on the steps of the Capitol on January 20th, 1981. Ronald Reagan was born in Tampico, Illinois, February 6, 1911. He grew up in several small towns in the rural northern part of the state, but his family eventually settled in the town of Dixon. It was there, while in high school, that Reagan performed for the first time in a school play. After graduating from Eureka College, he began working as a sports announcer for a Des Moines, Iowa radio station. In 1937, while in California covering baseball spring training, an agent from Warner Brothers signed Reagan for his first motion picture. That marked the beginning of a 28-year acting career that included more than 50 films. Reagan's acting career was interrupted by World War II when he served as an officer in the United States Army Air Force. When he was discharged, he returned to the film industry, but this time his attention was directed to the more political aspects of Hollywood as a New Deal Democrat. In 1947, Reagan was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild. Reagan was divorced from his first wife, actress Jane Wyman, in 1948. The couple had 2 children, a son and a daughter. In 1952, he married Nancy Davis. They later had a son and a daughter. He slowly turned conservative in these years and entered national politics in 1964 as a Republican when he campaigned on television for Barry Goldwater. It was after that appeal that several California businessmen suggested that Reagan run for governor. He easily captured the Republican Party's 1966 nomination and later that year won the governor's chair from the incumbent Edmund Brown. Almost immediately after that California election, Reagan assumed national political stature. In 1968, his name came up often as a possible presidential candidate. But his bid for the nomination proved to be unsuccessful. In 1976, another try for the GOP's top spot. In the '76 campaign, he attracted much support among conservatives. He also won a number of delegates in the West and South, but his backing was not strong enough, and he lost the nomination to Gerald Ford by a slim margin. He tried again last year. Reagan kicked off his successful bid for the nation's highest office November 13, 1979. Under the strategy direction of John Sears, Reagan kept a low profile, appeared infrequently. But Reagan's absence from political hustings became a major issue, and in February, changes were made in the Reagan camp. Sears and his cautious strategy were dumped. Reagan hit the campaign trail with a vengeance, and the candidate began to gain momentum. Soon, Reagan's fellow Republican nominees fell behind, and in July in Detroit at the Republican National Convention, Reagan was chosen to run for president. His choice for a running mate stirred much speculation, and for a while it appeared former President Gerald Ford might be part of a so-called co-presidency. That speculation was quickly dissolved when Reagan announced George Bush, a former rival for the nomination, would be his vice presidential choice. In the late summer and fall of 1980, the run for the presidential office took on a fevered pitch. The candidates, Reagan, the incumbent, Democrat President Carter, and independent John Anderson, traveled widely. President Carter met Reagan in a face-to-face debate in late October in Cleveland. Independent Anderson took part in the discussion, but only in a special arrangement provided by the cable news network. It was the one-on-one debate some pollsters say had an effect on the undecided voter, putting them in the Reagan camp.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you'll vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
As the campaign dwindled to a few days, the polls showed the race tightening, and many pollsters claimed the race was too close to call. As the votes were counted, however, the nation's choice was clear. 69-year-old Ronald Reagan would be the next president. Bob Kane, Cable News Network.
And some people seem to feel that nobody was better than just anybody. We'll explain a rather unusual demonstration when the News Channel returns. Stay with us.
This is Cable News Network.
A demonstration yesterday afternoon has to be considered somewhat unsuccessful at this hour. Dwight Casimir reports on a rally in San Francisco that was supposed to keep people away from the polling booth.
This group of demonstrators at San Francisco's Federal Building is protesting the fact that people voted at all today. They're a coalition of groups who believes that neither of the candidates offers a clear choice to the voters. The protest of about 100 demonstrators had all the overtones of the 60s. There was even a folk singer.
But our nature is imperialism's way. I'd rather cope with Dracula any day.
Leaders of this group say their message is a serious one, though. They're fed up with the political system, and they feel that people should have rejected it by not voting at all.
You want politics, you got to take theirs. You got to take their savior. You got to basically be limited to that. Today we're breaking with that. We're challenging that, and we're challenging people to step forward, to act in a historic way.
San Francisco police in full riot gear watched the protest from across the street. When the demonstrators began to march from the Federal Building to the Bank of America headquarters in downtown San Francisco, the riot police followed.
Well, essentially what you have here is a 60s type demonstration. In fact, some of the people here were involved in demonstrations at that time. We have police ready for riot activity, but there doesn't seem to be any of that kind of activity here. But it does give an indication of the kind of sentiment by some people who were not voting in San Francisco today. Dwight Casimir, Cable News.
Well, that demonstration was successful, and as we've been telling you all night long, they turned out, the voters turned out in record numbers, and they did elect Ronald Reagan as our 40th president of the United States. That's our report for this hour. Kathy Pepino coming up next, and our election coverage continues here on the News Channel. I'm Marvin Scott. Have a good day.
Hostage, Israel, government, business merger, refugee, oil supply, defense, the Klan, education, strikes, crime, riot, candidate, abscam, Iran, Iraq, religion, science, celebrity, the earth, the universe, the News Channel.
Well, there's never been a more humbling moment in my life. I would have been not only humbled by the extent of what has happened tonight, even if it had been the cliffhanger that all of us, I think, were expecting, it would have been the same way, but just to have had the support of the people of this country. I consider the trust that you have placed in me sacred, and I give you my sacred oath that I will do my utmost to justify your faith.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt. The people of the United States have made their choice, and of course I accept that decision, but I have to admit, not with the same enthusiasm that I accepted the decision 4 years ago.
Good morning. It's 6 a.m. in the East. I'm Kathy Pepino. Election Day 1980 is over, and the race that was supposed to be close wasn't. The voters of the United States gave Ronald Reagan an overwhelming victory over President Carter, and Republicans gained control of the Senate for the first time in 26 years. Well, Ronald Reagan's 12-year quest for the White House has climaxed with a popular and electoral vote landslide. 69-year-old former governor of California controlled the West and devastated the president in the Democratic strongholds throughout the Northeast, Midwest, and South. President Carter, noble in defeat, became the first elected incumbent to lose a re-election bid since Herbert Hoover in 1932. The president, accompanied by his strongest supporter, wife Rosalind, conceded defeat only hours after the first polls began to close. CNN's Mark Walton was there.
It was one of the earliest concession speeches in memory.
The president so anxious to get it over with that he overruled his advisors who gathered in this Washington hotel and made his appearance before 10 o'clock Eastern Time. There was no immediate congratulation for Ronald Reagan, instead a touch of bitterness at the top.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt.
His familiar smile carried him through the words as he braved the emotion of the moment. While wife Rosalind fought to hold back tears, Carter promised the best transition in history and shared some regrets.
I've not achieved all I set out to do. Perhaps no one ever does. But we have faced the tough issues. We've stood for and we fought for and we have achieved some very important goals for our country. These efforts will not end with this administration.
Later, campaign chief Robert Strauss told us he knew it was all over on Sunday afternoon. The Ayatollah, he said, cast the final straw.
We thought the Ayatollah had accomplished his purpose, I guess, because it really, we were going downward for 3 or 4 days, and on Friday it started coming back Saturday, and Sunday morning we met in my apartment, Pat Cadell and a number of us, and Hamilton Jordan, and looked good. Pat's stuff looked like it turned around a bit. We still were 2 points behind, but we could close that. 2.5, I would say. But then this hostage thing hit. It brought out all the frustrations of America. It just poured out then. Then we started going down 0.5 point an hour, almost.
It all happened so quickly, so suddenly that the tears had no time to flow. Supporters and Carter staff left here in shock. Blank looks on their faces. The finality of it all perhaps is yet to hit home. Mark Walton, Cable News, with the Carter campaign in Washington.
Well, Ronald Reagan, who was elected governor of California in 1966 and 1970, will now be the oldest man to assume the presidency. Last night in Los Angeles, Reagan accepted congratulations by phone from President Carter and John Anderson. Then, before 3,000 screaming supporters at the Century Plaza Hotel, Reagan accepted his victory by saying that he was humbled but not afraid of the future.
I am not frightened by what lies ahead, and I don't believe the American people are frightened by what lies ahead. Together, we're going to do what has to be done. We're going to put America back to work again. You know, I aim to try and tap that great American spirit that opened up this completely undeveloped continent from coast to coast and made it a great nation, survived several wars, survived a Great Depression, and we'll survive the problems that we face right now. When I accepted your nomination for president, I hesitatingly, but I asked for your prayers at that moment. I won't ask them for this in particular moment, but I will just say I would be very happy to have them in the days ahead. And now just all I can say to all of you is thank you, and thank you for more than just George Bush and myself. Thank you because if the trend continues, we may very well control one house of the Congress for the first time in a quarter of a century.
Well, today Reagan will meet with running mate George Bush, and both will plan for a news conference scheduled for tomorrow. John Anderson, the Independent, called the campaign the greatest event of his life. The 10-year term congressman appeared almost jubilant when he conceded a defeat that polls consistently told him to expect. But in the concession, he left his loyal supporters with the hope that he may try again in 1984.
You know, throughout this campaign, I have talked about a new realism in American politics.
And I've done that because I felt that our country was in trouble, that the nation simply had to face the facts. And now, of course, tonight, I must do the same. Actually, I don't want you to think that I just looked at my watch 5 minutes ago and came to the conclusion that perhaps the time had come to make this concession speech. I react somewhat more quickly than that, I can assure you. Actually, history will record that it was at 8:35 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Eastern Standard. Let's have it straight for the historical record. 8:35 that I telephoned Governor Reagan in California and offered my congratulations to him. Because the returns by that time had clearly shown that I was not destined to be the next president of the United States. That is a decision deferred.
Well, Anderson aides estimate that their campaign ended about $4 million in the red. And as it stands now, Anderson is holding on to a 6% of the vote, which would qualify him for federal matching funds. Now for an update on the latest figures, let's switch to our election desk and Don Miller and Marcia Leidendorf.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, Ronald Reagan's huge margin over President Carter became evident almost from the start yesterday evening. It has remained constant, and as we near the end of the total vote count, we look at the latest figures, with 95% of the precincts reporting. Reagan holds on to 51%, Carter has 41% of the popular vote. That's been that way for most of the evening. Anderson now has 7%. He was 6% for a long time. He needs 5% to qualify for federal funds for his campaign. And the Electoral College vote, looking now, you need 270 to win the presidency. Carter has 59, Reagan has 469, Anderson has none.
Well, thanks to the CNN graphic department, on this early hour, we have a graphic look at the sweep of some presidential elections in the past. So that might be very interesting. Let's go back to the year 1948. The Democrats are in red, and you'll see that popping up on your screen momentarily, hopefully. If not, try to imagine it. With Republicans having been claiming for some time, and the Republicans blue, which the Democrats say is a natural state for a Republican. In 1948, our colors show that you cannot see. Imagine again, Harry Truman won the race all over. But in 1948, the South was where it belonged with the Democrats. This was to change and change again. In 1960, in the Nixon-Kennedy contest, the Democrats, again supposed to be in red, use your imagination, and the Republicans in blue again. We can begin to see the build of a rush of support for the GOP building in the West, with Kennedy and the Democrats carrying still the traditional areas of the South to the north and to the east. In 1968, it was Nixon against Hubert Humphrey, a very close race, but the GOP continued its support in the West, and here and there were Democratic strongholds. In 1972, Nixon and the blue Republicans were everywhere in the race against George McGovern. By 1976, Jimmy Carter returned some states to the traditional fold, the South, the East. The West stayed Republican, however. The West, we have seen, is consistent since it became a population factor back in the Truman days, and that occurred right after World War II. And last night, as well as this morning, well, it looked like a repeat of the Nixon-McGovern situation. Reagan is everywhere. But throughout the summer and fall, the one sure bet for the Republicans was the West. The West was one, and unlike some politicians, when the West is one, it stays one. And now it has the South and the North as well. Just wasn't a very good day for the Reds. The Anderson factor was supposed to have had some influence on what happened to Jimmy Carter's vote, but now consensus is that it did not, really. In Massachusetts, for instance, Anderson's best state, he received 15% of the vote. Connecticut, he received 12%. But Reagan's nationwide victory was so overwhelming that, based on an early analysis, the Anderson impact was far less than had been feared. We state protectively, at this hour in the morning, that impact could develop, but it does not appear to be the thing third parties are made of.
Well, Don, none of the major pollsters came close to predicting the outcome of the presidential race this year. Almost all the polls conducted before Election Day concluded the race between Carter and Reagan was too close to call. Only Lewis Harris predicted a Reagan victory outright, but no one foresaw the landslide victory Reagan would roll in. The last Harris poll, published Sunday, gave Reagan 45% to 40% for Carter. George Gallup said it was even closer. Reagan 47%, Carter 43%. As we reported, the results were far different. The polls were short on the electoral count and state-by-state tallies as well. UPI's final survey showed Reagan with 245 electoral votes to Carter's 156, with 137 too close to call. As it turned out, Reagan approached 500 electoral votes, and Carter had well under 100. Two states that proved the polls wrong, New York, thought by UPI, the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, and others to go to Carter, ended up a Reagan victory. North Carolina, showing solidly for Carter in the polls, also went to Reagan.
Archie will be back in a second with a breakdown of the numbers, but for now, let's have a look at some of the senators whose faces will no longer be in the Senate and familiar to us on television as well. Senate Democrats, as you've noticed, if you've been watching, have fallen in a coast-to-coast conservative ambush, no less than that. With the loss of Idaho's Frank Church to conservative Stephen Sims, Republicans now have 50 certain seats. That's all they need to control the Senate, and that is the first time that has happened in a quarter century. GOP challenger Frank Murkowski is leading Clark Gurning in Alaska. North Carolina Republican John East has picked up a lead over incumbent Robert Morgan after the state was originally called for Morgan, so there's a change there. Vice President-elect George Bush casts the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, so half would have been enough to rule the Senate majority. Big liberal names fell across the country. John Durkin of New Hampshire, Birch Bayh of Indiana, George McGovern of South Dakota, and Warren Magnuson of Washington among the few. The only Senate seat Democrats might block up is in Arizona, where Barry Goldwater is running close to challenger Bill Schultz. There's only about 300 votes separating them, 95% of the vote in now, and we hope to have some finality on that race before too long. So no matter how the remaining races fall, Harry Byrd of Virginia, the only independent in the Senate, will be courted by both sides, but that, of course, is not necessary at this point now with late figures we have in. There's a 50-50 split now, and of course there's still one deciding vote more than they need to rule the Senate for the first time in a quarter century.
This race for control of the Senate has really been the most exciting thing we've been watching, especially since the presidential race was such a landslide for President-elect Reagan. So let's take a look at some of the numbers on the breakdown now in the Senate to see just exactly what's going on. It looks like there is a tie here. If you notice in the section that's labeled the new total, there are 50 Democrats so far, 50 Republicans. You need 51 in order to control. Now, the Democrats have elected during this election, they have elected 13 to the Senate, and Republicans have elected 19. They are even, basically. The holdovers, 35 to 31 for the Republicans. As I said, the new total is 50-50. And before this election happened, there were 59 Democrats in the Senate and 41 Republicans. So this is really quite an exciting time for the Republicans, because this will change something that has been going for 26 years. The Democrats have been in control of the Senate.
Well, when you look at the House control, of course, it's going to make it a lot easier for Ronald Reagan to gain some kind of footing in terms of being the new president with that new control in the Senate now by the Republicans.
Right, but the Democrats do control in the House still.
That's correct. At any rate, that's the summation of what we have to say at this moment. We'll be back in just a few minutes' time with some more updates as the information becomes available. Right now, let's go back to the anchor desk and Kathy Pepino.
And thank you, Donna Marcia. We'll have reaction both in the U.S. and throughout the world to Ronald Reagan's victory when the news channel continues. It's 18 minutes after the hour, and here's a look at the headlines. Ronald Reagan was the overwhelming victor in the presidential election, getting 51% of the popular vote to Jimmy Carter's 41%. The State Department refuses Iran's demands for a speedy public reply to its conditions for freeing the American hostages. And Chrysler Corporation says it will recall more than 600,000 Omni and Horizon subcompacts from the model years 1978 to 1980. Well, world reaction to the election of Ronald Reagan is mixed. In the Soviet Union, there have been only 2 dispatches to report the stunning election results, and one announcing that President Carter lost, and the second that Ronald Reagan had won. The dispatches showed no sign of pleasure or displeasure with the outcome. China vowed to keep a close watch on Reagan's policies towards Taiwan, saying that they hoped that Reagan's two-China policy was merely rhetoric. Taiwanese officials were elated at the results. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin says that he's looking forward to meeting the Republican victor. And Japan said that it hoped for improved relations with the U.S. under Reagan, but Canadian opposition politicians said that Reagan's victory could worsen what they already term neglected ties between the two North American neighbors. And Reagan's victory was celebrated in violence-torn El Salvador, where the Carter administration had supported the ruling junta. A reaction from Republican leaders to yesterday's election is predictably jubilant. Bill Brock, chairman of the Republican National Committee, says that the GOP victories in the presidential race, the House and the Senate, show a new coalition forming in his party.
So many votes of non-traditional Republicans, people, blue-collar workers, union members. That's fundamentally important if you're going to build a new coalition. The wins all the way down through the Congress to the legislative level. We're making spectacular gains all the way across the board. What the American people have done is to say they can't afford any more of what we've had for the last 4 years. We want jobs. We want to stop high prices, and we want to change. The only way to do that is to elect new leadership.
The reaction from Democratic leaders, of course, was just the opposite. In California, Governor Jerry Brown summed up the day for most Democrats.
To do. We got some rethinking, some rebuilding, and certainly this is a sad day for all of us. But I think we have to candidly admit the fact that it isn't just President Carter's loss, it's all of our loss. And now, in a very joint and unified way, we have to build our party right here in the state, become as strong as we can to rejuvenate this nation, work with a new president. When he's right, agree with him. When he's wrong, provide a loyal opposition. But most importantly, provide the unity and the new direction that will support Alan Cranston, support our congressmen, our assemblymen, and our senators, and build a very strong state and a strong nation. Thank you very much.
Governor Jerry Brown of California. Well, for reaction from the financial world on the Reagan victory, we go now to our bureau there and financial editor, Stuart Barney.
Kathy, we are now getting the first reaction to the Reagan victory from the overseas financial markets. They've been open for business through the night as the results here were being counted. All the markets showing price gains, and that includes gold, currencies and stocks. First of all, let's talk about gold. The first reaction came on the Hong Kong market. Shortly after that market opened, the news of a strong Reagan victory had arrived on the trading floor, and the gold price moved higher. It rose above $650 an ounce and eventually closed out the day at $654.50. That's up about $10. When the Hong Kong market closed, the Zurich market was just opening. The price there also moving above $650 an ounce. Apparently, gold's strength this morning is in response to nervousness about Reagan's victory and its possible impact on the hostage situation and the Persian Gulf War. The US dollar up sharply on the Tokyo exchange. It gained 2 yen earlier this morning and closed at the 211 level. Most of the dollar's strength, though, due to rising US interest rates. Currency traders apparently prefer Reagan's hard money economics, but that's very much a long-term prospect. Right now, the US currency is strong against the yen because it's seen as an attractive investment currency. We also have the first reaction on any of the world's stock markets coming from Japan. The market in Tokyo strong this morning. Defense-related stocks gaining ground on the expectation that with Reagan as president, the U.S. will pressure Japan to expand its own military power. So, at this stage, all the overseas financial markets gaining ground on the news of that very strong Reagan victory. That's the latest on business on this first day after the election. Now back to Kathy for more news.
All right, Stuart, thank you. Well, prospects of freedom for the 52 American hostages in Iran, which seemed to brighten after Iran announced its terms last weekend, have been clouded by a new dispute over the method of communication between Washington and Tehran. Iran has asked the United States for a swift reply in public to its 4 conditions for releasing the hostages. Well, State Department spokesman John Tratner told reporters that the U.S. will not hurry with an answer, and he said that when one is given, it'll be through diplomatic channels, not through the news media, as Iran demanded. Well, the Algerian ambassador had delivered the formal Iranian request to Washington, and Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher gave him a private message. CNN agriculture editor John Holloman is in Washington, and he has a report this morning on reaction of farmers to the Reagan victory.
Good morning. I'm just back from spending the night and much of the morning at Republican Party headquarters here in Washington. The atmosphere there was one of lots of noise and thousands of happy people. Ronald Reagan won. I talked to some of the Republican leaders in Washington to find out what they think will happen to farm policy under a Reagan administration. Here's the consensus. There will certainly be a lot of new faces at the Department of Agriculture. All the current political appointees, and that's probably more than 100, will be gone in 2 months, and they'll be replaced by Republicans. The experts I talked to say they don't expect to see any major changes in farm policy under a Republican administration. One thing which Reagan suggested he'd do early in the campaign is to end the grain sales embargo to Russia. In an interview with CNN a couple of weeks ago, the candidate hedged on that question. So whether or not he'll continue the embargo is still a big question. Some of the other questions for farmers will be the Republican idea on price supports and production controls. Reagan doesn't mind the target price concept, he says, or the basing of price supports on parity. So those probably won't be much changed. It's also expected by the experts that the grain reserve program will be continued at least for the next couple of years. It's going to be an interesting time of change for farmers in the next 4 years. John Holloman, Cable News, Washington.
And Flip Spiceland lets us know what the weather is going to be like on this day after the election when the news channel continues. And turning to the weather this morning, there's very little precipitation in the forecast. Flip Spiceland's here to tell us more.
Kathy, as you said, very little precipitation around the country right now. A few showers still lingering on the extreme eastern coastline. Now, right now, this frontal system, this cold front that moved through yesterday and brought some rain into the east on Election Day, is just hugging the shoreline right along the Atlantic coastline. And for that reason, there are still just a few showers, specifically in the Chesapeake Bay area and just moving out of Washington and into the Delaware and the lower Maryland Peninsula there. But that rain should be moving offshore a little bit later through the day. Another shower seems to be moving through Massachusetts, Connecticut, on out into the ocean from this section of the country. A couple of isolated showers over upstate New York. And that's about it. This frontal system, as it moves on through, is bringing cold air into the interior of the nation. The cool air is filling in behind it, and many places will see temperatures 20 degrees cooler than they were yesterday for their high temperature today. Now in the Midwest, it is very chilly, 36 in Chicago, 39 in St. Louis. On into the west, clear skies continue, but again, very cool temperatures. High pressure seems to continue to dominate the west. The rain in the Pacific Northwest has ended. So that's the way the weather is going to stack up throughout the day. Cooler temperatures and for the most part clear skies, and we'll be watching very closely throughout the early morning hours as to when the rain will end along the East Coast. Now back to Kathy.
And thank you, Flip. Well, veterinarian Dr. Herb Tanzer takes a look into the mailbag today to answer your questions about pets.
If my dog's nose is dry, does that mean that he's sick? Not necessarily. Dogs' noses vary depending upon the atmospheric conditions, so it's not a really reliable symptom. My child has pinworms. Could she have gotten them from the dog? Absolutely not. Dogs don't get pinworms, and therefore they can't give them to your youngster. If your child has pinworms, he or she's gotten them from another human being. My cat had a distemper shot when she was a kitten. Will that last her a lifetime? No, it's probably best to give her a booster shot at least once a year so that the body is reminded that she's immune to this terrible disease. Are sweets bad for dogs? No, sweets get blamed for lots of problems, but they seldom cause trouble. They don't cause worms. Worms come from other worms. And dogs just about never get cavities. So a little bit of sweets once in a while won't cause any trouble as long as you don't overdo it and spoil a dog's appetite. If I have my dog spayed, will that change her disposition? Not at all. This myth arises out of the fact that most dogs are spayed about the time they're becoming mature, and there's naturally going to be a slowdown. You know, you may have questions about your pet. If you do, we'd be more than happy to answer them. I'm Herb Tanzer with All About Pets.
Coming up, Dave Walker continues with the news, and we'll have continuing election updates for you throughout the morning. I'm Kathy Pepino. Have a good day and stay with us.
Good morning to you. It's 27 minutes before the hour on this, the 5th day of November. I'm Dave Walker. And the top story this morning is the overwhelming defeat of President Carter at the hands of Ronald Reagan. Reagan's campaign to make America great once again turned what observers had thought was a toss-up into a landslide. The 69-year-old former governor of California capped his 12-year quest for the presidency with a popular and electoral vote that devastated President Carter in every region of the country. Reagan controlled the West and won smashing victories in Democratic strongholds throughout the Northeast and in the Midwest and the South. The outcome became evident early in the evening as the voters expressed their preference when leaving polling places across the country. One only has to recall how President Carter appeared yesterday morning after he cast his vote in Plains, Georgia High School, his hometown. He expressed confidence. But then, in an emotional address to his hometown friends, he signaled he was ready for the American electorate's verdict, and that all happened yesterday. For both Ronald Reagan and President Carter, accepting victory and conceding defeat were moments of reflection and restraint.
There's never been a more humbling moment in my life. I would have been not only humbled by the extent of what has happened tonight, even if it had been the cliffhanger that all of us, I think, were expecting, it would have been the same way, but just to have had the support of the people of this country. I consider the trust that you have placed in me sacred, and I give you my sacred oath that I will do my utmost to justify your faith.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt. The people of the United States have made their choice, and of course I accept that decision. But I have to admit, not with the same enthusiasm that I accepted the decision 4 years ago.
John Anderson, the Independent, called the campaign the greatest event of his life. Every poll taken before the election told Anderson not to expect any victory, but early in the evening, when the inevitable became reality, Anderson's concession contained no regrets, but only pride.
I think it has been worth it because we have tried with the kind of ideas that we expressed in that program and that he and I talked about on the stump and that all of these great surrogates have talked about as well. We have tried to bring a new sense of unity, a new sense of shared purpose to the political life of this country. And I think that that call is one that is going to have to continue to be heard around the nation, even though we have not prevailed in the sense that we have not won this election, a majority in the Electoral College or anything like it. I think that we must continue, all of us who have worked together, to share that common cause and that single vision of what our nation can become.
Ronald Reagan's victory in the 49th presidential election will be recorded as a classic example of the coattail effect. Now, for the first time in 26 years, the Republicans have gained control of the U.S. Senate. The nationwide Reagan victory helped end the careers of prominent liberals from coast to coast. One of the few concessions this morning for the Democrats is that they will retain control of the House of Representatives. However, even in the lower chamber, the Republicans made significant gains. CNN's David Browdy reports on how the Republicans reacted to their impressive victories.
The Republicans started the evening confident. They ended snake dancing around the floor in ecstasy, riding the wave of the biggest sweep since Richard Nixon's devastation of George McGovern in 1972.
It's a bigger victory and it's a better one because it goes down deep and it's broadly based. The fact that we've gotten so many votes of non-traditional Republicans, people, blue-collar workers, union members, that's fundamentally important if you're going to build a new coalition.
The Republicans won the seats they were expected to. They won almost all those considered toss-ups, and they won many the Democrats thought were theirs to keep. What brought it about? Reagan had coattails, but the Republicans had a lot of help, too, from conservative political action committees like the Moral Majority and the National Conservative Political Action Committee.
Well, certainly that gives you the media advertising that you need, but I think the main thing is the message that they had. They were talking about slowing down the growth of government. They were talking about a strong national defense. They were talking about getting government off your back and out of your pocketbook. These are the things that the people in America are looking for in the 80s, and these are the kind of things that people are going to be winning on as they campaign in the years to come.
Pack up all your cares and woes. Here we go, singing, oh, bye, bye, Jimmy.
As the Republicans sang their new post-campaign song, the crowd went home happy. Not only had they won the White House, but state houses and increases on Capitol Hill as well.
During the Nixon landslide, the Republicans gained a large number of seats, but quickly lost them for reasons that don't apply to this election. The question is not how many seats they gain tonight, but whether they will be able to keep the momentum going and add to the already impressive numbers they have in both the House and the Senate. I'm Dave Browdy, Cable News Network at Reagan headquarters in Washington.
Now for an update on the latest returns, here's Don Miller and Marcia Ladendorf at the election desk.
Thank you, Dave. We indeed have an overview of what has happened and transpired tonight. And Marcia, you can fill us in on the top details.
Okay, thanks a lot, Don. Well, Republicans won big in yesterday's general elections, taking both the White House and the U.S. Senate. We'll have the Senate story in just a moment. But first, let's look at the figures showing Ronald Reagan's victory over President Jimmy Carter. These are the latest figures we have. With about 95% of the vote in, it appears that the margin has stayed pretty much the same, 51% for Reagan, 41% for Carter. Apparently we don't have those figures up yet, but I'll tell you about them anyway. The real thing that has happened, or the most significant thing that's happened, is that just in the last few minutes, Carter carried Hawaii. That gives him 4 electoral votes, and I don't think it's going to help him very much. Don?
As we reported just moments ago, the Republicans now appear to have full control of the U.S. Senate, and the Democrats have retained control of the House of Representatives, but have lost about 24 House seats in the Reagan landslide. So in the Senate this morning, the winners and losers are as follows. Republican John East over incumbent Robert Morgan in North Carolina. It was a very close race there. In Idaho, Republican Steve Sims was has defeated incumbent Democrat Frank Church. In Colorado, Senator Gary Hart edged Maverick Republican Mary Estelle Buchanan. In South Dakota, Republican James Abner defeated incumbent Democrat George McGovern. That was unexpected, although it was expected to be a tight race. Incumbent Democrat John Culver was defeated by Republican George Grassley. In Iowa, Indiana's Birch Bayh lost to Republican Dan Quayle. In Florida, former Public Service Commissioner Paula Hawkins defeated Democrat William Gunter. In Alabama, Republican Jeremiah Denton, a war hero and ex-prisoner of war, defeated Democrat Jim Folsom. It was a close race in Pennsylvania. Arlen Specter did come out the winner, beating Democrat Pete Flaherty. He's the former mayor of Pittsburgh, by the way. And in a major surprise, Republican Alphonse D'Amato beat both 20-year Senator Jacob Javits and Democrat Elizabeth Holtzman in New York. And in Washington state, 75-year-old Democratic Senator Warren Magnuson was defeated by Republican Slade Gordon. Marcia?
Well, Don, apparently we do have those figures now on the latest on the presidential election, so let's look at them. As I said, the presidential popular vote right now, 51% for Reagan and 41% for Carter. It's been a 10% margin there that's gone through much of the evening. Anderson has 7%, and that's good news for him since he will be able to get federal funds to help pay for his campaign expenses. In the Electoral College count, We are pretty much the same, 469 for President-elect Reagan, and 59 plus 4 from Hawaii, which just recently announced that Carter carried it, and 0 for Anderson. You need 270 to win.
Well, the Republicans have just picked up another seat, Marcia, in the U.S. Senate. We were talking about the Senate just moments ago, saying that the Republicans have gained control of the Senate. Frank Murkowski, according to United Press International, has defeated Democrat Clark Gruening in Alaska, repeating Alaska goes Republican in the U.S. Senate. The winner, Frank Murkowski, and that gives the Republicans definite control now of the Senate. The House, of course, stays in the control of the Democrats. Marcia?
Well, Don, overnight, the Republicans have captured Democratic-held governorships in Missouri, Washington, Arkansas, and North Dakota. More victories for the Republicans. This brings the GOP nearly even with the Democrats. In Arkansas, the GOP's Frank White defeated incumbent Bill Clinton, the 34-year-old Democrat. In North Dakota, Alan Olson stopped Governor Arthur Link. Former Missouri Governor Christopher Kit Bond, a Republican, defeated Governor Joseph Teasdale. Washington State now has John Spellman as governor, as that Republican won over James A. McDermott, who beat Dixie Lee Ray in the primary. But a Rockefeller once again is back in the political news. West Virginia's John D. Rockefeller, the third, a Democrat, won a second term, defeating former Republican Governor Arch Moore. And that win could become the launching pad for a presidential try in 1984, and that raises the economically interesting specter of Rockefeller money versus Kennedy money. With more returns from the state mansions, Democrat James Hunt won in North Carolina over I. Beverly Lake. Hunt could pose a threat to the Republican conservative Senator Jesse Helms in 2 years. Delaware, Republican Governor Pierre DuPont won a second term over William Gordy. Indiana, Republican Lieutenant Governor Robert Orr became governor, defeating John Hillenbrand, the second. Montana, Democratic Governor Ted Schwinden stopped Republican Jack Ramirez. New Hampshire Governor Hugh Gallen won his second term by defeating former Governor Meldrum Thompson. Rhode Island, Democrat Governor Joseph Garahy defeated Vincent Cianci. Utah, Democrat Governor Scott Matheson won a second term over Bob Wright. And in Vermont, Republican Governor Richard Snelling won a third term by defeating Jerome Diamond. Don?
Well, Marcia, I thank you for spending the evening with me, even although it was in front of the television cameras. It has been an interesting night. Unfortunately for us, not as exciting as it could have been. Things were wrapped up. NBC wrapped it up at 8:15 in terms of the presidential race, so somewhat anticlimactic, but still fun watching some of the late races.
It was interesting watching the Senate races because a lot of people were curious about the coattail effect.
Back and forth. At any rate, that ties it up for Marcia Ladendorf and myself. Don Miller, thank you very much for watching. And Dave Walker is now standing by to deliver more news, so stay with us.
Thanks, Don. And I guess if this election year proves anything, it proves that all the so-called political experts and all the pollers were wrong. Next up, we're going to show you a guy who won a very important election but refused to talk about it. Well, as I mentioned, there was a very important vote. I don't know if it all happened yesterday, but it was in baseball. It's for the Cy Young winner, and I guess the winner still doesn't want to talk about it.
He hasn't talked to the media in 6 years now. When he had a bad year 6 years ago, of course, was talking about Steve Carlton. He didn't talk to the media then. He says, I don't need the media. They badmouthed him a little bit. So he still doesn't talk to him 6 years later. You know, no real surprise at the recipient of the National League Cy Young Award. He had an outstanding World Series last month, a carryover from the regular season. Of course, we're talking about Steve Carlton, the big lefty with the Philadelphia Phillies. He pulled in 23 out of a possible 24 first-place votes. Carlton received his third Cy Young Award for good reason. He posted an unbelievable 24-9 record with a 2.34 ERA and 286 strikeouts. Carlton won the award back in 1972 and in 77. Only two other men have won the honor 3 times. It's Sandy Koufax and Tom Seaver. Incidentally, the one vote that Carlton didn't receive went to the Los Angeles Dodgers' Jerry Royce. And speaking of the Los Angeles Dodgers, outfielder Dusty Baker is going the free agent route. He'll test the market like a number of other ball players on November 13th. Baker made that obvious yesterday when he turned down a rather lucrative offer. Baker said no to the Dodger Blue when they offered him a 5-year, $3.5 million offer. And even with the elections taking the spotlight, the National Basketball Association had a couple of games on the schedule board. We'll go to the scores from there. And Washington taking on Atlanta. Well, it's Washington 122-98 over the Atlanta Hawks. Kevin Greavy had 28 points. Detroit a bucket up on Milwaukee. The Pistons now 2-10. That snaps a 10-game winning streak for the Bucks. San Diego big over Dallas. We have Utah beating Kansas City by the score of 107-104. Adrian Dantley, the leading scorer in the NBA, had 33 points. Phoenix just up on the Pacers, and Los Angeles holds on and beats Portland. National Hockey League, not as gutsy, but they only put 2 games on the ice. The scores from there, we have the Islanders beating Detroit by 2. Dennis Potvin set a new club record for the Islanders with 5 assists, and Montreal beats Quebec 5-4. Guy Lapointe had the tie-breaking goal that midway through the 3rd period. And Dave, Montreal having their worst start in 42 years. They're not doing too well right now.
Okay, thank you, Dan. As we all know, presidents may come and go, but a healthy body lasts forever. Words to live by, Dan. Arden Zinn is here now with more of her sun salutation exercises to keep the body trim.
Continuing with the sun salutation, this is position 4. And what I want you to be very aware of is that your heel stays directly underneath your knee, and this is the stretch. Reach your left leg behind you. Look up at the ceiling and gently reach your hips closer to the floor. Now make certain as you're doing this that your foot is directly underneath your knee. The knee should not be forward. And gently stretch. Stretch. Stretch and hold. Breathe. Inhale. Exhale. And now straighten both legs and reach back to your left heel. Stretch. This should feel good to you. Your head is down and hold the position. Relax and concentrate on your spine. Let your right knee bend again and gently stretch. Stretch. Now you can play with this position and let your left knee come to the floor and gently stretch again. Feel it in your hips, feel it in your spine. And hold it. Once again, raise your left leg and gently stretch. 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 Stretch and hold. Feel the stretch. Stay. Stay. Hold it. This is Arden Zinn, Cable News Network.
Of course, the election will have a lot of impact on the financial markets, and CNN financial editor Stuart Varney is in New York right now with a report on how the gold market is reacting to Ronald Reagan's victory.
Dave, as we reported earlier this morning, the price of gold has risen on the Hong Kong and European markets earlier today. And to analyze the reaction of the world's gold markets just after the election, we have with us this morning Andrew Baxter, who is president of Dreyfus Gold Deposits. Andrew, is the gold price rise today that we've seen so far in response to the Ronald Reagan victory?
I think to some extent it probably has to be. It's generally accepted by observers of the gold markets that a Reagan administration would be pro-gold. They want very much to deal with the problems of inflation, and a couple of the economists, Jude Wanniski and Art Laffer, who are generally regarded as being 2 of Reagan's key advisors, have frequently espoused some form of returning gold to our currency system. Exactly how it would happen remains to be seen, if in fact at all. But it's generally accepted that there would be some return to some form of a gold standard, certainly a lot of discussion about it, and that has to be interpreted as being reasonably bullish for the price of gold.
However, isn't that very much in the long term, and we are talking about today's trading? I mean, that would seem like a long-term prospect, and here we have a move in the price of gold today. Isn't that a bit of a contradiction?
Well, interestingly enough, a $10 move in the price of gold, given the volatility that we've had in the gold markets in the last year, for example, really doesn't represent much. If the price of gold had moved $40 or $50 in the world markets, I think that that would be something that you would have to pay serious attention to and say that there's clearly a dramatic response. But a $10 move in the price of gold on a day-to-day basis really doesn't represent much of a reaction at all.
The gold traders that you know, were they adjusting their portfolios to take account of a possible Reagan victory just before the election?
I don't think there's really been a lot of positioning, either unloading gold shares or physical gold, or loading up in response to a number of the things that have been going on, either the conflict in the Middle East or the presidential election here. Interestingly, the gold price has been as subject to technical influences as opposed to fundamental influences, anxiety influences in the world, as it has ever been. It's actually been reasonably quiet, and we haven't really noticed any major response to what's been going on.
All right, Andrew Baxter, many thanks indeed for joining us this morning on the Cable News Network. That's the latest from our business desk here in New York, and now back to Atlanta for more election news.
This is Cable News Network.
And throughout the nation, millions of people gathered last night to watch the election returns, and CNN's Marvin Scott went to a popular watering hole in Atlanta last night to get reaction from Georgians on the defeat of their native son.
Like most other Americans, Georgians gathered around television sets to learn whether the first Georgian elected president will be returning to the White House or to his home in Plains. Very few people in this bar, a popular gathering place in Atlanta, were disappointed by the outcome.
I am thrilled to death with the outcome of the election.
I don't know. I think we're ready. It's time for a good change. I really do.
My reaction is that I'm very happy. I feel very positive for our nation.
You disappointed President Carter was defeated?
No, not at all. I voted for Anderson.
I'm still a Carter fan. I'm disappointed, and I'm the only one here that is.
Most of the people in here tonight seem to be for Reagan. I didn't hear much hooping and hollering for Carter at all.
Obviously, the patrons of this bar don't reflect the opinion of most Georgians. After all, Georgia is one of the few states Jimmy Carter did carry. As for those Georgians who are upset over the outcome, well, they don't really feel that they're losing a president, but simply regaining a neighbor. In Atlanta, this is Marvin Scott, Cable News Network.
Kind of makes you wonder whatever happened to the Peanut Brigade. That's it for now. I'm Dave Walker. Good morning. The News Channel continues with Lois Hart in a moment. Right now to the assignment desk with Jim Rutledge.
And Atlanta correspondent Gloria Murray will patrol the city's streets tonight with police in a crackdown of kids violating curfew while a child killer still stalks the city. And in Greensboro, North Carolina, correspondent Mike Betcha will have a report today on jury deliberations in the trial of 5 men accused of killing 6 communists during an anti-Klan march last year. Good morning, I'm Jim Rutledge.
Business merger, refugee, oil supply, defense, the Klan, education, strikes, crime, riot, candidates, Abscan, Iran, Iraq, religion, science, celebrity, the earth, the universe, the News Channel.
Good morning, I'm Lois Hart. It's 7 o'clock in the East, and today is Wednesday, November 5th, 1980, the day after Election Day. In a stunning electoral victory, Ronald Reagan wins all but a handful of states to be named president-elect. And the defeated incumbent president promises a smooth and orderly transition of power. Also in this half hour, we'll have the latest returns from the CNN election desk and a look at the stunning Republican sweep in the Senate. Despite predictions of a close race, Ronald Reagan has won a landslide victory over President Carter. cutting deeply into traditionally Democratic blue-collar ranks in the industrial Northeast and Midwest, Reagan had the election virtually sewed up before returns began coming in from his solid Western power base. Yesterday, voting was a big win, but not only for Reagan, but for the Republican Party as well. For the first time in 28 years, the GOP has won control of the Senate. Democrats did, however, retain a majority of the House of Representatives. Reagan's victorious campaign was an unswerving attack on Carter's first term. In addition to the traditional Democratic working-class support, Reagan also got solid Republican Party unity and fervent backing of a new political force, fundamentalist Christians and anti-abortion groups. He told his supporters in Los Angeles last night he would do his utmost to justify the trust the voters placed in him.
I am not frightened by what lies ahead, and I don't believe the American people are frightened by what lies ahead. Together, we're going to do what has to be done. We're going to put America back to work again. You know, I aim to try and tap that great American spirit that opened up this completely undeveloped continent from coast to coast and made it a great nation, survived several wars, survived a Great Depression, and will survive the problems that we face right now. When I accepted your nomination for president, I hesitatingly, but I asked for your prayers at that moment. I won't ask them for this in particular moment, but I will just say I would be very happy to have them in the days ahead. And now just all I can say to all of you is thank you, and thank you for more than just George Bush and myself. Thank you because if the trend continues, we may very well control one house of the Congress for the first time in a quarter of a century.
For Carter, news of the Reagan victory came quickly and decisively. In fact, polls were still open in 10 states when the president went before his supporters in Washington to concede defeat.
It was one of the earliest concession speeches in memory. The president so anxious to get it over with that he overruled his advisors who gathered in this Washington hotel and made his appearance before 10 o'clock Eastern Time. There was no immediate congratulation for Ronald Reagan, instead a touch of bitterness at the top.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt.
His familiar smile carried him through the words as he braved the emotion of the moment. While wife Rosalind fought to hold back tears, Carter promised the best transition in history and shared some regrets.
I've not achieved all I set out to do. Perhaps no one ever does. But we have faced the tough issues. We've stood for and we fought for and we have achieved some very important goals for our country. These efforts will not end with this administration.
Later, campaign chief Robert Strauss told us he knew it was all over on Sunday afternoon. The Ayatollah, he said, cast the final straw.
We thought the Ayatollah had accomplished his purpose, I guess, because it really, we were going downward for 3 or 4 days, and on Friday it started coming back Saturday, and Sunday morning we met in my apartment, Pat Cadell and a number of us, and Hamilton Jordan, and looked good. Pat's stuff looked like it turned around a bit. We still were 2 points behind, but we could close that. 2.5, I would say. But then this hostage thing hit, and it brought out all the frustrations of America. It just poured out then. Then we started going down 0.5 point an hour, almost.
It all happened so quickly, so suddenly that the tears had no time to flow. Supporters and Carter staff left here in shock. Blank looks on their faces. The finality of it all perhaps is yet to hit home. Mark Walton, Cable News, with the Carter campaign in Washington.
Although he said before the campaign he believed in miracles, John Anderson's dream did not come true last night. The independent won no electoral votes. He did get, however, 7% of the popular vote, qualifying him for federal matching funds to help pay off his campaign debts. CNN's Dan Brewster was with Anderson and his supporters in Washington.
As John Anderson sat with his family and running mate Patrick Lucy, he seemed as surprised as most political observers with the early returns, showing Ronald Reagan gaining a comfortable lead. Anderson waited until after Jimmy Carter's concession speech to address his supporters. The crowd had shown very little enthusiasm until the Illinois congressman was introduced by his running mate. He promptly admitted the results were unmistakable.
8:35, that I telephoned Governor Reagan in California and offered my congratulations to him, because the returns by that time had clearly shown that I was not destined to be the next president of the United States. That is a decision deferred.
Although his statement was intentionally cryptic, the implication was clear. Anderson does not want to disappear from the national political arena. He did not, however, say specifically what his plans for the future were. There had been speculation that Anderson is considering trying to start a third party. He joked with reporters about retaining 6% of the vote indicated by late evening returns.
This has been, I think, this campaign, the greatest event of my life. And obviously, of course, I am now hoping that we hold at 6% at least, so it doesn't turn out to be the most expensive as well.
Anderson needs to win 5% of the total vote to be eligible for federal matching funds. Dan Brewster, Cable News in Washington.
In addition to the big Reagan win, Republicans across the country scored impressive victories. The GOP has now assured control of the Senate for the first time in 28 years. Among the big-name Senate Democrats to fall, John Duran of New Hampshire, Birch Bayh of Indiana, George McGovern of South Dakota, and Warren Magnuson of Washington. There will also be 4 additional Republican governors across the country. Democrats, though, did retain control of the House. GOP leaders, predictably, are happy with the showing.
The fact that we've gotten so many votes of non-traditional Republicans, people, blue-collar workers, union members, that's fundamentally important if you're going to build a new coalition. The wins all the way down through the Congress to the legislative level. We're making spectacular gains all the way across the board. What the American people have done is to say they can't afford any more of what we've had for the last 4 years. We want jobs, we want to stop high prices, and we want to change. The only way to do that is to elect new leadership.
Coming up next on the News Channel, we'll go to the election desk for a look at the latest returns in the Senate races and the rest of the election contests. Checking the headlines at 12 minutes after the hour, Republican Ronald Reagan wins a landslide victory over President Carter. Reagan racking up 469 electoral votes in 42 states. Carter collecting only 42% of the popular vote and just 63 electoral votes. Independent John Anderson wins only 7% of the popular vote, but that's enough to qualify him for federal matching funds to help him pay off his campaign debts. And another delay in the release of the 52 American hostages. After meeting with Iranian officials, West Germany's ambassador says release of the hostages may be at least 10 days away. Well, it is early morning here in the East, but in many parts